Chapter 435. Laren, Zindi, Mattias, and Amran still hadn't left. How could they? They were waiting for a proper opportunity. The truth was that although Laren's plan was excellent, executing it would be far more difficult. It wasn't as though they could just plop a bunch of novels and movies in front of King Arthur and expect him to read and watch them all. Whether he even would was one matter, but by the time he did it would probably already be too late. Who cared if Arthur threw a fit after Camelot had already been assimilated by the Empire? By then, they could just send someone to kill him with ease and it wouldn't matter in the slightest. Our best bet is most definitely an illusion specialist. It will be difficult finding one strong enough to cause him to fall, and even more expensive, but it will be worth it. It's the most seamless option we have. The four of them seemed to all agree with this. King Arthur's strength was something they looked down upon initially, until they were in the same room as the man. They couldn't deny the pressure he placed on them, it was undeniable. Not a bad plan. The four were stunned. If these words had been spoken by one of them, it would be fine. The issue was that it most definitely hadn't been. And, to make things worse, they recognized the voice it was spoken by as well. Lionel slowly walked out of the forest, causing the four to be shaken. How had they not heard his approach until just now? That was impossible. Amran's gaze narrowed, his golden eyes piercing toward Lionel. Unfortunately, before they could focus too much on Lionel, another, much louder set of footsteps caught their attention. They spun around, only to find Aina walking forward with a great sword dragging in her hands across the forest floor. Compared to the flustered girl she had been just a while prior, her current cold expression seemed worlds apart. Yip! Yip! A little mink dashed along the tree branches, appearing from a third direction. Lionel, what do you think you're doing? Mattias could no longer hold back his temper. Lionel had already infuriated him enough once, but this blatant provocation was too much for any human to handle. Do you understand what you're doing, kid? Zindi cut in, her green eyes locking onto Lionel. Enlighten me. Instead of taking these words as an opportunity, the four hidden family members only grew more enraged toward Lionel's response. They didn't want to have to explain themselves to a child, and it seemed even more pathetic to do so. Those who had strength didn't need to speak, they could just do. They didn't have to convince anyone of anything. No takers? Lionel almost pouted in disappointment. Truthfully, he was looking forward to learning more about these hidden families. Other than seeing their hair color, he knew nothing else about them. Well, he did know a bit about the Brazinger family's lineage factor thanks to Aina. But, this was about it. Lionel shook his head. I'll give you two options. The first option is to surrender. Allow us to escort you to a holding cell within Camelot until negotiations are complete. After this, we will release you and you can go about your business. The second is to battle. Should you do this, however, you will definitely die. Lionel didn't add any flowery words of encouragement or any coercion in the slightest. He simply laid out the facts as they were. These four had no idea, but they were facing two opponents who had already stepped into the fourth dimension. Not only had Aina done so, but the little mink had done so as well. On top of that, there was Lionel whose ability was already at the pinnacle of the fifth dimension and was supported by a mind within the fourth. With only four of them, they simply stood no chance. The truth was that Lionel suspected that Amran had already stepped into the fourth dimension. He could tell simply by observing him that he was different from the other three. But, Lionel didn't believe that this would make a large difference. Still, Lionel made a mental note that he needed to understand more about the fourth dimension. Because he didn't have the latter portions of dimensional cleanse, he was flying in the dark about how the power systems of the fourth dimension functioned. As such, he found it difficult to scan the stats of someone within this dimension. However, Lionel's gut feeling told him that the combination of Aina and the little mink was more than enough to deal with this golden-haired man. As for the other three, they were his. So, which choice will you make? Lionel brandished his bow, his demeanor calm and collected. The four began to sweat. This wasn't just a problem of facing the three before them. The main issue was that they were still in enemy territory. Defeating these brats was one thing, but what if Camelot mobilized an army? What would they do then? They didn't feel that these three were stupid enough to come without requesting any sort of backup assistance, right? They couldn't have. Lionel's lip curled into a smile. The most important thing about applying pressure on a person wasn't how much you applied, but when you applied it. If you used all your tactics immediately on a strong-minded individual, they would all fall flat. But, if you simply poked at someone when they were in their most fragile state, they would collapse like a house of cards. Lionel pointed toward the green-haired lady. You have a lineage factor that has great synergy with plants. In your mind, you're probably undefeatable in a forest facing opponents like us, right? You're probably even more confident than a usual member of your family because your ability is a grade-hardened ability that reinforces the chemical structure of objects to make them tougher than the strongest diamonds and the best alloys. Is that right? Quite a great synergy of your abilities. Would be quite a hassle to deal with a flood of vines all harder than the sharpest swords. Zindi shuddered, the subtle movements she had made to control the vegetation in the surroundings coming to a grinding halt. Lionel's smirk deepened, pointing toward Mattias. And you? Chapter 436. Your lineage factor is quite interesting. A defensive-type lineage factor that relies on the fluidity of your body, is that right? Your ability is a C-grade sharpened sight ability that also synergizes well with your lineage factor. I'm sure you're good at hand-to-hand combat, commendable. Lionel spoke with a smile, his demeanor relaxed. There's also you. Lionel continued. Your light elemental lineage factor is quite intriguing, focusing on your attack strength, HM. I'm sure that pairing that with your fifth-dimensional wind elemental ability helps you quite a bit, right? Amaran's gaze narrowed further. Lionel's words had subtly revealed the fact he was quite aware of his strength yet still dared to stand here. Among those here, he was the only one with an ability that touched the realms of the fifth dimension, or so he thought. But now that Lionel was speaking so nonchalantly, he wasn't confident in this matter any longer. Was this brat more dangerous than he originally thought? And you? Lionel's smile faded, his gaze locking onto Laren, the red-haired Brazinger family member. Your lineage factor is related to your blood and your bodily strength. As for your ability, it's of the S grade and only gives you perfect recall of events, is that right? Lionel's cheerfulness had completely vanished. Even as a method of applying pressure, he couldn't stand to continue putting up such a facade for a man from that family. So, what is your choice? Lionel continued coldly. The pressure was palpable. In this world, one of the most protected secrets of a person was their ability. When it came down to a crucial moment, what an opponent did or didn't know about your ability could decide your life and death. The simple truth was that abilities came in all shapes and sizes. And, even if by some miracle two people received two near-identical abilities, the methods by which they used them could be strikingly different. In a fictional world, everyone had set and predictable patterns that could be used to follow an opponent's intentions in the midst of battle. But, in the real world, a burly man could just as easily bring out a strong wind affinity. A person with a strong fire lineage factor could easily be born with a water elemental ability. It was even possible for a close combat specialist to be even better in the long range simply due to an ability they were born with. So, one could imagine how it might feel to have your abilities displayed so grandly. And, not only that, but for their lineage factors to be exposed as well. Almost any thoughts they had of surprise or trickery vanished. It was at that moment that Laren suddenly began to laugh. You know, all this time I was wondering why it was you hated me so much. Laren's laughter grew, his blood boiling. So that's why. I get it, Lionel calmly weighed his black bow in his hands, his gaze never leaving the four before him. Laren's gaze turned toward Aina and his laughter only grew. Brats, I have nothing to do with the matters of all those years ago. I'm not sure why you're targeting me for the actions of a few. Those people you want to kill me for only treat me slightly better than the piece of dirt they see those of impure blood as. Laren's gaze reddened. Clearly, he was feeling indignant. His feelings made sense, for the most part. He obviously didn't receive very great treatment from the family. Maybe it was because his talent wasn't as great, maybe it was because his ability didn't have very great offensive prowess, or maybe it was because he didn't have much backing within the family itself. Regardless of the reason, being targeted because of the actions of someone you didn't like very much to begin with wasn't a pleasant feeling. Of course Laren remembered Aina. Lionel had just described his ability as perfect recall. It could be said that the only reason he didn't recognize Aina immediately was because it had been almost 2 decades since he last saw her from afar. In fact, it wasn't even Aina's looks. No, what he remembered was the exact pattern of the scars drawn across her face. This was his perfect recall at work. How could 2 women have the exact same pattern of scars? Lionel's gaze narrowed at Laren's words, but he still nodded slightly. Even though he wanted to reject Laren's words due to his own bias, he knew that not accepting such a thing and hating him just because of the family he came from would make him no different from the Brazinger family. Like I've said already, if you want to live then just surrender yourselves. I'll release you all just the same. And you expect me to believe that? Do you have a choice? Do you really think we came here alone? The only reason the others haven't closed in is because there's no need to risk innocent lives when it could all be resolved by us. But, if you force us to act, even if by some miracle you manage to defeat the 3 of us, there'll be a world's kingdom waiting to deal with you. Laren and the others shuddered. The only one who still managed to remain a semblance of calm was Amren. After a long while, Amren sighed. Kids are getting more and more brazen every day. We asked you if you really knew what you were getting into before, but the question still remains the same. Are you sure you know what you're getting into? Lionel shook his head. Seems you're the one still not getting it. Sir Lancelot. At that moment, the clanking of armor sounded. Amren's confident expression finally changed. In the seemingly quiet forest, the sound of unsheathing blades and rattling chainmail rebounded through the greenery. Somehow, without their knowledge, an entire troop of knights had surrounded them from all directions. At this point, Amren realized he had been played. Though Lionel was maybe confident in defeating them all, doing so while also preventing them from having enough time to activate their talismans to return to Earth would have been too difficult. So, he stalled for time. Now where would they go? Chapter 437. Lionel watched as the 4 were escorted away. He felt better than he thought he would. Being able to resolve things with his words again rather than his fists left him feeling light. Well, technically he still relied on strength this time around. If it wasn't for his vastly improved method of using Camelot's mage art magic system, it would have been impossible for him to hide so much movement from them all. This was especially considering Laren's perfect recall ability. If there was even a single blade of grass out of place, he likely would have been seen through. Still, Lionel was happy. He didn't have anything to complain about. He could only hope that the negotiations the Empire went as smoothly. Unfortunately, Lionel could only be hopeful about this. The power imbalance between the Empire and them, even if Camelot and the Demon Empire came together, was too large. He obviously couldn't use bully tactics as he had just done if this was the case. Are you sure we'll be able to hold him? A sudden voice cut into Lionel's thoughts. When he looked over, he found Lancelot's figure beside him. Lancelot was wearing the same smile he always did. His mood seemed great. But, Lionel was quite aware that much of this was a facade. A leader of men didn't always have the luxury of wearing his heart on his sleeve. This was a curse that it seemed both Lancelot and Arthur were afflicted with. Lionel nodded. The restrictions I placed on him are modified 3-star Magus arts. Though they're not able to stop him completely, it will take him some effort to break them even if he goes all out. My estimate sits at 7 seconds. By the time he breaks it, he'll already be aware and that time is enough for me to activate the teleportation key I hid on him. Lancelot nodded with some assurance, his smile as bright as ever. About these negotiations, Lionel. I'm curious about this Ascension Empire and what joining them means for Camelot. Lionel sighed. The Ascension Empire is just like any other. Its main focus is growth, expansion, and holding on to its power. In the past, what mattered most was your talent, and now what also matters most is still your talent. In truth, I wouldn't say that it's any different from Camelot. The only difference is that compared to being at the top like you are now, you will have to fight to hold such a position again. Lionel swept a glance toward Lancelot, half expecting him to defend Camelot and speak words about how much they loved their people and other similar things. In truth, Lionel was being quite kind to Camelot. Compared to the Empire, Camelot treated its lesser-thans far worse. At least on the surface, anyway. Lionel would never forget that the Empire allowed billions to die just so that it would be easier to deal with invalid tides. In fact, much of the reason Lionel didn't run into an invalid despite the early stages Earth was in was precisely because of this. Other worlds in similar positions would have to spend centuries fighting against invalids. By the time they established themselves, their worlds would have to be separated in safe and unsafe zones. But by killing so much immediately, Earth never had to deal with this problem. And, with the exception of the oceans where humans couldn't normally reside anyway, everywhere else was still reasonably safe. Sometimes, Lionel couldn't help but wonder how much of the invention of Paradise Islands were about land shortage, and how much was a plan for this all along. I see. Lancelot nodded, not a hint of derision on his face. I hope they will be better at finding talents than we have been. Lancelot smiled somewhat sadly, a slight crack showing in his usual facade. I didn't have an opportunity to say it before, but am sorry for what happened to you. To think that you would also be our savior as well, how ironic. Lionel gave a slight chuckle. I can't take credit for that, it wasn't intentional. In truth, I did it mostly to save my own life. It's just that my selfishness happened to help others. Selfishness, huh? Lancelot sighed, his blue irises dimming somewhat. It's unfortunate that selfishness isn't always possible, and selflessness isn't always rewarded. Lionel remained silent for a long while before finally speaking. Selflessness can only be rewarded after selfishness has finished taking everything it wants first. After that, the selfless can only find time and space to heal. Lancelot froze. He looked toward Lionel's side profile, his pupils visibly trembling. Was it just a coincidence? Lionel's words seemed to resonate with Lancelot's soul. Time and space to heal. At that moment, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. Lionel's gaze sharpened. It's here? That was enough? All this time, Lionel had felt a feeling tugging at the back of his mind. However, his dreamscape didn't seem capable of finding the answer. So, Lionel did it himself. Lionel's mind was even more powerful than maybe even he himself knew. The more he thought about it, the more possibilities he crossed off, the more he realized that there was only one possible explanation left: the zone quests hadn't ended yet. Camelot had already become a part of true history, and Lionel had already saved King Arthur from a fate of death. If he could just resolve the love triangle, everything would be perfect. But, there was one issue with this. Lionel couldn't possibly kill Mordred. Let alone the fact that he wouldn't have the heart to do so even if he didn't know her so well. They were now intimately acquainted. To Lionel, killing Mordred would feel no different from killing any one of his teammates. He couldn't bear it. But, that moment when he called Mordred his friend, something clicked. Zones were not a game, so their quests didn't exist just for the sake of existing. The quests were in place as guides to those who entered, allowing them to help along the resolution of the zone as a whole. This was a simple matter. Lionel had long since learned as much during his time within the Joan Zone. What did all of this mean, then? It meant that the quests themselves were not as important as the function they served. Saving King Arthur. Resolving the love triangle. Killing Mordred. Making King Arthur a part of true history. What did all of these quests have in common? It was all about resolving Arthur as a person, helping him to complete his character arc. Oftentimes it was difficult for someone who had been wronged to forgive. There was definitely a timeline of events where Mordred would never forgive her father and even choose to continue her attempts to kill him. When a person is too far gone, despite how tragic their pasts might be, the crudest way to deal with them would be to kill them, in such a reality, Arthur would mourn the loss of his daughter with his wife and son, while Lancelot, being the good man that he is, would take a step back and allow the family to come together. In such a way, Mordred's death would become the catalyst to truly heal Arthur of his ailments. But what if Mordred didn't choose that path? What if she was alright with reconnecting with her family? What if she made the first friend she ever had? In such a case, wouldn't it fulfill the same requirements as her death would have? The savior of King Arthur. The manifestation of Camelot. The resolution of the love triangle. The death of Mordred. The sound of shattering glass resounded throughout the small moon as the world continued to tremble. Lionel felt his heart suddenly thrum to life. It wasn't just him, but every citizen of Earth's world felt the very same way at that exact moment. It was then Lionel understood what his actions meant. Earth was evolving into a fourth-dimensional world. However, Lionel expected what happened next even less. Chapter 438. It had been several weeks since the disappearance of Lionel and Aina. By now, those who had spectated the Brave City trials were well aware that these two youths would not have to participate. Of course, many had an understanding of exactly what this meant. For these two to be personally escorted by the overseers and then disappear, there was a high likelihood that both Lionel and Aina were given the rights to directly enter Valiant Heart Mountain. Unfortunately, there was nothing the others could do about this. Without a choice, they could only continue to follow the proceedings, hoping to gain a spot for themselves. Still, this was the real world. Hopes and dreams couldn't be manifested at will, nor could strong desires make one more talented or wield more power. The so-called geniuses of terrain fell one after another beneath the trials, and it very much seemed as though this would be a repeat of every other year prior where not a single person was selected. However, it was exactly then that a young man stood out. The story of Anared Kefir, the heir to the Kefir city lord title, was quite an interesting one. Since his youth, he had always been known as the genius of terrain just as much as he had been known for his insane tendencies. He was a man who protected his little sister to a fault and was even quite protective of his little sister's best friend as well, though she could be a bit of a ditz. However, the truth was that Anared had always been within the realm of understanding for those of terrain. Though he was lauded and praised, he was ultimately just one of a long line of geniuses that wouldn't amount to much at all in the dimensional verse. Terrain was too small, the talents it could produce were too weak, and the starting point of those talents it did manage to produce were too low. With these shackles on his future progress, Anared participated in the last Brave City trial. Without suspense, just like all those who came before him, he failed. The memory was still quite vivid in the eyes of those who had witnessed it all. There were a total of 8 trials to complete. In order to be accepted into Valiant Heart Mountain as the lowest tier disciple, it was necessary to pass at least the 4th. But back then, Anared only managed to make it halfway through the 2nd trial. The trial was a sea of wooden puppets. The only task was to make it from one side of the room to the other, but for so many, it was a trial they would never pass. As a mere king back then, Anared scratched and clawed, his eyes a furious shade of red. Even when he was forcefully pulled out of the trial by the overseers at that time, his gaze was still wholly focused on the goal ahead of him. He looked like he would rather die than not make it to the other side. It was impossible to tell what his motivation was. Who could read the mind of a madman? Did he just want to get stronger? Did he have something to protect? Something he wanted to accomplish? No one knew. But those red eyes and the way he clung to the broken hilt of his sword was seared into the minds of all those who watched that day. After failing the trial, it became hard to hear of Anared again. All people knew was that he went off to travel for several years, even missing the next entry to Brave City. Many thought he had given up due to that. But no one blamed him. He was a talented young man who went to see the world and even managed to come back with a beautiful wife. There was no doubt that Era was a preeminent beauty of terrain. Not only this, but she also had the refined demeanor of a lady. But what no one expected was for Anared to participate in this one as well. Not only for him to succeed, but for him to completely outperform his previous limitations. Many thought that Anared was at most on par with the other emperors. In fact, due to the way he reacted when the other emperors came to apply pressure to his sector, many confirmed this belief. But, once again, no one could get a read on the thoughts of a madman. He crossed the third trial and faced the fourth. Many emperors of the past had reached this level but could never clear it. It was a trial that tested one's movement speed and flexibility, a death obstacle course of swinging blades and shadow-hidden assassins. Yet, Anared crossed it with ease. With a sword in his hand, his movements became like flowing water. Even as the other emperors failed at this step, he crossed into the fifth trial, then the sixth. In the end, under the astonished gazes of all those around him, Anared made it through the seventh and almost all the way through the eighth before he was forced to stop. Beaten and bloodied, he stood on the final eighth floor, the jagged bladed axe of a giant having stopped just before his neck. Even at that moment, a defiant look blazed within his eyes. He kept looking up at the giant as though he still wanted to hack it to pieces. It was clear to anyone who saw him that he was still unsatisfied with his result. Xyler watched on from afar, his hands tightly gripped around his broken spear shaft. He hadn't even been able to pass through the first trial. No amount of fire in his gut or will in his soul could help him overcome his lack of talent at the moment. All sorts of complex feelings shook his core as he watched Anared proceed to where no one of Terrain had ventured before. It was as though watching Anared do it gave him even more determination to do it himself. He too would reach that level one day, he too would shock everyone with a single feat. Chapter 439. Anared calmly received his spatial ring, the sword hovering to his back still singing. It was clear that his battle intent was still roaring, but there was no longer a trial to face. He had failed to clear the final hurdle. After a few words from the overseers, everyone was ejected from Brave City. Another round had come to an end. It would be several more years until Brave City opened up its tall, bloodthirsty gates once again. Days later, within the Carefree family city lordship, a meeting was taking place. But, if those who understood the relations between the city lords saw this meeting, they would be shocked out of their wits. Not only was the forever lone wolf black family city lord present, but even the swan family city lord who had always butted heads with the Carefree family was present. To make matters more shocking, this was just one of the usually estranged or clashing relationships in the room. City lords from all over Terrain were gathered, each one with a complicated network of relationships with those around them. Yet, each and every single one of them had set aside their differences to appear at this meeting. The setting was a room reserved for grand banquets. Elaborate chandeliers hung in the air, long tables that extended for tens of meters seated those numbering in the several dozen, while the decorations were designed to impress. Though this wasn't the most appropriate location for such a meeting, it was the only place that could house so many important characters. It wasn't that there were hundreds of city lords on Terrain. In fact, there were only a dozen. The main issue was that none of these city lords, due to what was at stake, would want to appear here unguarded and unprotected. The luck of it was that since these city lords had brought their entourages to Brave City in the first place, they wouldn't draw the attention of those they wanted to hide their actions from. In fact, the fact they had all appeared in such a large banquet rather than slinking off sneakily made this even less of a matter to pay attention to. Of course, there was one other big reason this would work despite how foolish it was. They all had a reason to attend this banquet. And that reason was provided to them by the success of Anared Carefree. City Lord Carefree stood from his hosting position, a confident smile on his face. Even his full beard couldn't hide the grin on his lips. You all know the rules. These were the first words the city lord said. As for what the rules were, only they knew that. Since my son has met the goal we all set, I will be taking the lead of this operation as previously agreed upon. I hope that there would be no rejections to this, right? The banquet hall remained silent. They weren't fools. They knew that anyone who rocked the boat now would be immediately executed, city lord or not. It was precisely because of how volatile this seemingly genial atmosphere was that they all brought their guards despite the lack of secrecy that could cause. It was only with the status provided by Anared that they could execute this operation with less worries. As such, it was only right the Kefir family took the lead. It was just unfortunate that none of their own heirs could have the same accomplishments. Hearing such words, the various guards and lesser vassals of the city lords looked around in confusion. What they didn't know was that the so-called rules were exactly in place to cause this sort of vagueness and unassuredness. This operation had been being planned for years. Actually, it was more accurate to say that it had been decades. In all this time, this was the very first instance in which all the city lords had come together. In fact, this was the very first time they all had a direct line of communication with one another. Other than City Lord Kefir, the others hadn't even been sure that all the city lords would participate. It was only now that they were all certain that everyone was on board. But, it was exactly this secrecy and this slyness that gave the city lords confidence. There were eyes and ears everywhere, especially in this era of abilities. It could be said that City Lord Kefir had proved himself. Even if Anared had failed, they would have still elected him to be the leader of this operation. This operation was too important to them. It could be said that even in the case of Anared failing, they would have moved forward regardless. When it came to matters of life and death and the futures of their coming generations, they had to be prepared. Good. I want everyone to be ready to move out within the month. The month quickly came and went. The city lords had been prepared to move out any day for the last 5 years already. Let alone being prepared within a month, they had long since primed themselves. Among these 12 city lords, there were 4 women. And, among these women, there was one with a very complicated relationship with City Lord Kefir. Though the common people didn't dare to spread rumors about city lords, what was to stop the city lords themselves from doing so? It was said that in their youth, this City Lord White was once a lover of City Lord Kefir. However, for whatever reason, City Lord Kefir married another who gave birth to his current son and daughter. According to the rumors, City Lord White visited the Kefir city lordship just once in the last 30 years. And it was said that she brought a baby along with her back then. But, when she left, that baby was no longer on her person. Regardless of whether those rumors were true or not, City Lord White had long since returned to her city. The thoughts of all those years ago had long since been thrust from her mind. Chapter 440. City Lord White sat in an office, a map spread out across her desk. She had long since memorized its contents, but due to a sudden change that happened a while ago, she wanted to ensure that she had it all imprinted into her mind. The City Lord was quite unique in comparison to other women of terrain. It was very rare to find technologically advanced places like Earth, and thus even rarer to find equality amongst men and women, at least in low-level worlds. Technology acted as an equating factor between men and women. The strength of a man meant less if a woman could simply pull out a gun and deal with a threat just as easily as he could. In low-level worlds like terrain, the awakening of abilities didn't have much time to create a balance between the sexes like technology could. This was all to say that in terrain and worlds like it, having women in positions of power was a rarity. And, finding women like City Lord White was even a level more rare. City Lord White had exceptionally short-cut white hair. Her demeanor was quite valiant, and she chose to wear black robes accented by white flexible armor. Everything from the way she sat and spoke seemed to exude a masculine air. Even her handwriting was boisterous, purposeful, and bold. She was quite tall, especially for a woman. She stood at over 6 feet, but this didn't dampen her figure in the slightest. Her hips were wide and her bosom was bountiful. At that very moment, seemingly without reason, City Lord White froze. She stood, a sadistic grin on her face. Her face even became somewhat flushed as though she was excited. She touched a spatial bracer on her right arm. Her gaze only grew more excited after pulling out a talisman glowing with a blinding light. It was finally time. Bang! She smashed a fist against her large desk, splitting it in half and kicking its pieces out of her way. Her hand swept forward and snatched out the map before it could fall to the ground, carelessly tossing it into her spatial bracer. "Someone get me my Clara. Now!" Her booming voice shot over White City. An impossibly vast aura shot out from the City Lord's body. The result was a city that fell into immediate silence. It didn't matter if it was a noble or a humble street vendor, they all felt their knees buckle. The city lord's mansion began to glow. City Lord White kicked down the door of her office. To the side of the now broken opening, a patient secretary with her hands respectfully clasped before her sent a glance toward the flying door and didn't seem to react very much at all. City Lord White turned toward the secretary, a bloodthirsty light in her eye. It was difficult to tell if she was excited, enraged, or in heat. "Naya, give me my Clara, we're moving out." "Yes, City Lord." The secretary bowed politely. With a small clap of her hands, a light appeared in the secretary's hands and slowly expanded. Eventually, when that light dimmed, all that was left was a monstrosity of a weapon. It had a polearm of 2.5 meters long alone. But the true shock was its head. It was a hammer, but even calling it so seemed to not do it justice. The head had 2 massive blunt ends that shimmered like the surface of a mirror. Each head just under a meter in diameter each, easily matching more than half the size of most bodies. City Lord White snatched this massive weapon from Naya's hands. "Ah, Clara, Clara, Clara. We're going to taste blood again." Clara seemed to react to these words too, a shimmering light racing across its polished surface. City Lord White strolled down the hallways of her mansion, wantonly swinging Clara around and not giving a damn about the damage. Naya could only follow quickly behind, calmly taking note of all the newly created holes and sending out orders for repair. The two quickly made their way out of the mansion, every one of City Lord White's steps causing the ground to sway and tremble. The head of City Lord White's mansion was completely unlike what one would expect. While others would pave the way for vehicles or decorate with elaborate gardens, the front of the White Mansion was a military field. On this military field, tens of thousands of warriors had already gotten into formation. They all stood ramrod straight, their chests sticking out with pride. "Hi!" The instant City Lord White appeared, a collective breath was taken as the army roared as one. The crisp sound of shifting clothing pierced through the soul as they saluted in unison, crossing their hands over their hearts. City Lord White stood atop the stairs of her mansion, her smothering aura towering into the skies. Bang! The butt of her massive weapon smashed against the ground, causing waves of trembling earth to spread in every direction. To her back, Naya continued to stand, her hands clasped together respectfully. The importance of this battle wasn't lost on any of them. This was a turning point. For a long time already, terrain had been teetering at the very edge, standing at the start of a diverging path. To one side, there was the abandonment of everything their ancestors had ever built, everything they had ever strived for. To the other, there was a slim hope. But it required their sweat, their tears, their blood. And, even then, they could very well fail. Their future would be decided by this battle, this war. Whether they could hold their heads high or be buried in the cemetery of their hopes and dreams, it would all be decided now. Today, we go to battle. Hi. Today, we'll brandish our blades toward the necks of our enemies. Hi. Today, we'll either shed blood or shed the blood of others. Hi. Follow me to those crimson fields. Give me the beating hearts from your chests. Lay down your lives for me. Hi. 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 The glow of White City grew to a fever pitch. Then, inexplicably, the entire city disappeared. Chapter 441. It's time. In Black City, preparations were underway as well. The only difference was that while City Lord White took sole leadership, Black City was headed by a father-son pair. Jirak was stunned out of his thoughts when he heard his father's voice. The two men looked practically like copies of one another. Jirak's father had the same bald-held, black armor and jagged beard his son did. The only difference was that Jirak's father was a head taller than he was. Obviously, since Jirak was already in his 30s, this wasn't a matter of youth. Rather, Jirak's father simply had a far larger stature. Get the men ready. Jirak's father continued. The city will be disappearing in just a few minutes. Yes, father. Jirak nodded and went off to complete the last of his duties. Jirak was lost in his thoughts as he made his way toward the military fields. Black City wouldn't be taking action immediately, so their mental state didn't need to be in a primed state. Not that Jirak was in the head space to give a motivational speech to begin with. He had just failed the brave city trials miserably and his heart was still being shadowed by a perpetual guilt. Even now, he could still remember Lionel's complete disregard of him. If Lionel had ignored him, it would have been one thing. But, Jirak remembered making eye contact with Lionel just one time while they were both still on the first floor. Back then, it had been as though Lionel was looking at a stranger. He glanced at him as though he was observing someone he had seen for the first time and moved away from him just as easily. The way Lionel looked at him at that moment was something he would never forget, at least if Lionel never looked in his direction, he could make himself believe that Lionel felt some anger toward him. Somehow, he felt that that would make him feel better. After all, anger was just another way of acknowledging someone's existence. But, to so genuinely treat him as though they had never met before, as the son and heir to a city lordship, he never thought he would ever have to deal with emotions like this. He never thought anything could make him feel this way, let alone due to someone he had met so recently. However, deep down, Jirak knew that his emotions were less about Lionel and more about letting down himself. Jirak shook his head. It doesn't matter anymore. Back on Camelot's moon, Lionel was still in a state of shock. He hadn't expected that the zone quests had truly not been over, but he had expected even less that the reward for completing them would be accelerating Earth into the fourth dimension. Lionel's expression changed. Without waiting for anyone to react, he shot to Amran's side and sent the strongest punch he could at the latter's chin. Amran was completely flabbergasted by the change. He still didn't understand what was happening. All he knew was that he was bound now, and even if he wasn't, it would take him too much time to undo Lionel's restrictions. His last thought was that Lionel had tricked him and that he was basically a dead man. His vision went black, collapsing to the ground. Lancelot's eyes widened. Lancelot froze. Huh. At that moment, Lancelot suddenly felt as though shackles that had held him down for decades suddenly imploded. Strength flooded into his body at impossible rates. In the blink of an eye he was twice as powerful, then 3 times, then 4 times. Eventually, it got to be so much that even he no longer understood just how powerful he was in comparison to his former self. Lionel stumbled backward, the forcefulness of Lancelot's breakthrough being too great. The wind kicked up and even the several-meter-thick trees around them began to sway. Lionel put a forearm over his eyes, trying to peek through to see what was happening. But, he soon realized that it wasn't just Lancelot. At that moment, dozens, even hundreds of knights they had brought with them were experiencing similar power boosts. Lionel looked down at Amran's unconscious body and suddenly felt a bit bad. The reason he had taken him down like that was because if Camelot entered the fourth dimension, the restrictions on Amran's strength would have been completely lifted. By then, he would have been too troublesome to deal with. Lionel sent an apologetic gaze toward the other 3 hidden family members. But, considering the fear in their eyes and the way they were trying to distance themselves, Lionel felt that his smile might not have been as kind as he thought. Aina smiled lightly at Lionel's embarrassed expression. But, truthfully, Lionel made the right move in such a situation. The worst-case scenario was definitely a terrible situation they didn't want to be in. This makes sense, though. They've been stuck at the peak of the third dimension for so long, it's only right they break through. It's likely related to their unique magic system, too, Aina. Aina blinked, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. Lionel couldn't help but smile when he saw this. She was still so shy, all he did was call her name. Aina currently found it troublesome to even look at Lionel. Every time she did, she would remember what happened before. She furiously shook her head, looking away. Lionel began to ask the question he was planning to, but Lancelot's sudden burst of laughter shocked him out of his train of thought. Lancelot spread out his arms as though trying to catch the rays of the sun falling through the heavy canopies above. For the first time in months, the heavy rain of Camelot finally came to a stop, allowing the clouds to separate. As a warrior, Lancelot had spent his whole life training. He never thought there would be a day where he could finally break through the final barrier, but here that day was. He felt better than he ever had before. To an outside observer, he had simply broken through. But to him, it felt as though he had seen the light at the end of a dark tunnel. He hadn't thought that a simple shift in his mindset would bring him such benefits. Lionel, thank you. Lionel opened his mouth to respond again, but it seemed as though the universe had something against him today. But, this time, the cause of the interruption was far more serious. It was serious to the point where it just might decide the life and death of Earth as a world. The sound of shattering glass reverberated throughout. Whether you were on Camelot, on the moon, or on Earth, everyone heard it. It felt as though the fabric of time and space itself was quaking, threatening to tear itself apart. Lionel looked up through the dense foliage, barely catching a glimpse of a sight he would never forget in his life. A city had appeared in the sky. And, this city was falling toward them. At the top of this city's gates, a lone woman dressed in black robes accented by white soft armor stood, a massive hammer in her hand as she looked down toward the rapidly approaching Camelot. A bloodthirsty aura soon enveloped their lands. Those faint of heart felt as though there simply wasn't enough air to breathe. Terrain was invading. Chapter 442. Lionel's eyes widened. Everything suddenly clicked at once. However, there was simply no time to harp on it. Run! Lionel roared. The impact of such a massive object hitting the ground from such a height would be enormous. A meteor of 100 kilometers across would be enough to annihilate all life on Earth. Even though this city was only 10 kilometers across and its velocity was much slower in comparison to a meteor, Lionel was absolutely certain that its hardness was far beyond anything a normal meteor could compare with. If this wasn't the case, how would they dare to stay within its walls as they fell from the skies? Plus, this wasn't Earth. It was a small moon. Lionel wasn't sure how his calculations would change in a true fourth-dimensional world like this one, but he didn't have the mental space to spare. Without hesitation, Lionel grasped at Aina's hand and charged out. But, he soon realized that despite his speed, Aina actually had no problem keeping up with him. In fact, she was the one dragging him forward. Swiftness, second wind, breath of wings, Lionel cast as many wind speed spells as he could in quick succession. His affinity for the wind element wasn't very high, so the expenditure of his soul force was several levels more. But, this wasn't a situation where he had the mind to care about such things. The knights around Lionel and Aina were a second later in reacting, but they too shot forward trusting in Lionel's judgment. With their speed, even covering a few hundred meters wouldn't be impossible by the time the city hit the ground. In this situation, every extra foot they could gain was an extra chance at living. Lionel's soul force continued to surge. He never realized it before, but it seemed that shackles on his own body were loosening greatly as well. His mind felt freer than it ever had before. Lionel let Aina pull him along, his mind entirely focused on his spell. He dug deep, a violent wind kicking up around him. Yip! Yip! Don't worry about me, little black star. Stay in the air and in your incorporeal state. Don't come down here, we'll be fine. The little mink skipped through the air, steps of black fog forming before it. But, a clearly distressed expression was on his little face. Though the little guy couldn't understand what was happening, he had a deep enough connection with Lionel to know that something bad was coming. The more panicked the knights saw Lionel feel, the more panicked they also seemed to become. The most troublesome part about it all was that they were in a forest, constantly having to dodge around trees and branches. The terrain made them slow down by several factors more than they would have in practically any other landscape. Without time to care for anything else, they had even gone as far as to abandon the prisoners they had already captured, allowing them to run on their own. At that moment, the city falling from the skies was already within half a kilometer of the ground. Just the wind pressure of its descent was enough to give Lionel an even stronger tailwind than previously, allowing his spell formation to speed up by several levels. Brace yourselves. Lionel roared. Lionel pulled back on Aina's hand, stunning her for a moment. All of her forward momentum stalled in that instant. But Lionel didn't give her time to say anything else. With one swift motion, he grabbed onto her slender waist and sent the large curved package on her back and the great sword in her hand into the segmented cube. Instead of continuing forward, Lionel launched himself into the air, cradling Aina's body close to his own. Lionel's body seemed enveloped by a blinding light in that moment. Those who could only catch a faint glimpse would swear that they had laid eyes on a soaring bird. He leapt from tree branch to tree branch, shooting past 100 meters into the air in what felt like the blink of an eye. The instant Lionel reached the tallest canopy, his gaze sharpened, all the strength he could muster bowing his legs and causing his thighs to explosively increase a fold in size. Ha! Lionel flooded force into his legs and launched himself toward the clouds. As though he was a bullet, he left a streak of golden light in his wake, a violent cyclone of wind shattering the tree he had used as a springboard. In the distance, the city reached within 100 meters of the ground. The wind pressure alone flattened the forest beneath it, uprooting trees and sending them flying in every direction. Shoo! Bang! The city suddenly came to a sudden grinding halt. Unlike what Lionel had expected, it never physically touched the ground. However, the damage. It was one of the most basic laws of physics. For every action, there was an equal and opposite reaction. A city falling from the skies like a meteor, weighing an impossibly great amount, suddenly coming to a stop like that wouldn't magically make everything better. The world seemed to fall silent for a moment until the ground suddenly registered just the level of force it was about to withstand. The earth exploded, surging like a tide along with strong winds to all sides. If trees were uprooted before, now, even ancient trees that dug hundreds of meters into the ground were blasted away. The soil, the rock, the greenery, it was all uprooted, spreading out as though using the floating city as the epicenter of disaster. The tsunami of Earth seemed to gain speed the further it spread, its momentum increasing and rolling over endlessly. At this moment, Lionel had reached his apex, just barely 500 meters above the surface. Seeing what was happening below him, his jaw clenched. He wasn't sure if the others could survive, but at the moment, he didn't have time to worry about them. Even he wasn't safe just yet. Veins bulged out from Lionel's forehead, his strain reaching a new level. Float. Chapter 443. Using a spell you had no affinity with took an obscene amount of spirit pressure. Sometimes, when the Mage Academy of Camelot gained a child of rare affinity, they would have no choice but to give them a teacher who might very well not have any talent in the child's field. In such a case, the teacher would do their best to guide the child in the fundamentals. But, even in that case, the strongest spells the teacher might cast would be apprentice-level arts. However, float wasn't an apprentice-level art. In fact, it was well known as one of the most difficult to cast magus arts in all of Camelot. Not only was Lionel casting a 3-star magus art he had no affinity with, but he was also using it in a situation he had no business using it in. Float was only meant to help one hover 10 meters above the ground at most. And even then, every second one spent at that height would cost a huge expenditure of spirit pressure even for a high-affinity wind mage. Yet, Lionel not only had no wind affinity, but he was over 500 meters in the sky. Wind mages would often use float, like an earth mage would use a defensive technique. It was only a method of protecting themselves in battle for a short period of time. Every extra meter they soared into the air, the exponentially more spirit pressure they would need to use. "Send me inside," Aina suddenly said. She hadn't spoken a word since Lionel pressed her against his chest like this. She didn't want to admit it to herself, but she found it to be quite comfortable. But, her comfort wasn't worth Lionel's strain. The fact that Lionel had sent her box and sword in was enough to show that every extra pound was a huge strain to him. Of course, it wasn't that Lionel wouldn't rather send Aina in, but rather that sending in a living object compared to an inanimate one was a completely different concept. For the same reason Lionel had to knock Ailiard out first before stuffing him into a snow globe, he couldn't casually send Aina wherever he wanted whenever he wanted. In that split second, it was better for him to take this action than explaining his plan. Who knew what might happen? If he told Aina not to resist and that he'd be fine, who knew if she'd believe him? Just when Lionel was about to answer Aina and agree to her suggestion, veins bulging across his forehead, it hit them. Yip! Yip! Do as I said. Lionel roared in his mind. Bang! It was just the surge of wind finally reaching them. It was far weaker than what it was on the ground. Yet, it felt as though they had been smashed by a sledgehammer. Lionel wrapped his arms around Aina tightly. He could feel bits and pieces of rocks and chipped wood rebounding across his back, trying to tear his skin apart. Lionel! Aina cried out. Lionel grinned. In all his life, this was only the second time he could remember Aina calling out his name. Don't worry, I have thick skin. Lionel sent his voice to Aina's ears. If not for this, it was doubtful that she would be able to hear him at all. Aina didn't seem comforted by these words at all, but there was nothing she could do. If she tried to force her way out of Lionel's protection, it would only make everything worse. There was no time where Lionel wanted to use his shuttle more, but he knew it would be useless to do so here. The shuttle provided too little control. It was great at straight-line speed, but Lionel had just been in a forest. By the time he managed to make it above the foliage, it was already too late to guarantee making it out of the range of the shockwave. If the shuttle got hit by the shockwave, Lionel was certain it would be able to hold up against the elements alone, but he would have no control of it. According to his simulations, the likelihood of it crashing into the ground was near 100%. In that case, it was far better to rely on his own body, which he had far more control of. And, even though the surfboard form of the shuttle gave greater nimbleness, it provided no protection whatsoever. If Lionel brought it out now, it would be more likely to just get lost in all the chaos instead of helping them escape. I'll definitely modify that damn thing. Lionel roared in his heart as he tumbled through the air like loose trash. Every time it seemed that Lionel might be headed toward the ground, he would grit his teeth and activate, float, in full force again, slowing his descent. It was exactly this level of control he wouldn't have in the shuttle. Slowly but surely, the tsunami of earth and walls of wind began to calm. According to Lionel calculations, they had been blown over 2 kilometers away from their original location, and this was after going half a kilometer into the skies. Lionel couldn't even imagine the devastation on the ground. Seeing that it was calm enough, Lionel slowly opened his eyes. The surroundings were filled with a dense fog of dirt and soil. It was the kind of air one couldn't breathe in too deeply. Lionel summoned the shuttle and entered the surfboard mode, instantly stopping his descent to the ground. He slowly rose, trying to get to a point where his vision was clear of this mushroom cloud of earth. When he finally did, he was already over a kilometer above the surface, and what he saw left him stunned. Devastation. Absolute devastation. Where there once was an endless forest of greenery, there was nothing but overturned earth. The land had become a slosh of broken trees, sand, soil, and rock. Lionel couldn't even begin to imagine the devastation this had caused to the wildlife, and he was even more worried about what happened to Lancelot and the others. Aina looked down from her position in Lionel's arms, her heart also trembling. They both locked eyes onto the floating city in the distance. At that moment, White City finally completed its descent, perfectly fitting into the hole in the ground it had created. Seeing such a scene, Lionel shuddered. What was the most difficult part about invading another world? Wasn't it gaining a foothold? But, what if you came with your own foothold? What if you brought your own fortified city to launch your attacks from? Chapter 444. Lionel took a deep breath. At the moment, they were about 20 or so kilometers from Camelot's main city. But, between here and there were 2 baronies and several smaller settlements. Who knew how many of them were affected by this earthen tsunami? Though it benefits them to bring a city along, they definitely faced complications themselves. There were many benefits to wiping out all the land around them like this. the main of which was the fact this fallen city didn't have to worry about attacks in the immediate future while also wiping out any potential nearby settlements Camelot might have had. But this method was a double-edged sword. While White City now couldn't be easily attacked, they also couldn't easily launch any attacks either. Marching an army through this mess would be a nightmare. It made Lionel feel like this was a purposeful choice. Lionel felt that there was an over 98% chance that their current attackers were the city lords of Terrain. The information he had access to put him in a unique position where he likely knew more about their current enemies than anyone of the Empire or the Slayer Legion did. This perspective allowed him to understand that this wasn't a quick invasion plan. If Lionel put himself in the shoes of those city lords, their goal wasn't just to conquer Earth, it was to make Earth their new home. The reason for this could be summarized in a single sentence: Earth had more potential than Terrain. As for why they waited until now, that was even more straightforward. There was no coincidence they waited for the exact instant Earth evolved into the fourth dimension. And, unfortunately, due to Camelot's appearance, this happened long before Earth had fully settled itself. Lionel's actions had inadvertently placed Earth in a bad position. Lionel felt somewhat complicated. On the one hand, he felt that Earth was no longer truly a home to him anymore. But, on the other, he felt a twisting pain in his chest watching it being invaded this way. Lionel descended from the skies, riding his jet-black surfboard back into the dense cloud of kicked-up dirt and soil. "Bear with it for a bit." Lionel spoke softly to Aina. "I want to see if I can find any of the others." Aina wanted to say something like "You can let me go now," but sensing Lionel's downcast mood, she remained silent, resting her ear against his chest. Lionel touched down to the ground, his brows furrowing. "This will be difficult, but it's still worth a try." Repulse. A sphere of wind twirled around Lionel and suddenly expanded violently. In the blink of an eye, it cleared the heavy atmosphere. Repulse was a 3-star mage art usually used as an area control sphere to push enemies away. So, it was quite effective in its task. Lionel took a deep breath in the cleared air, closing his eyes and planting his 2 feet firmly in what ground he could find. In fact, he sunk in ankle-deep into the rolling dirt and rocks. Seismic wave. A strong surge of spirit pressure shot out from Lionel. If one looked closely, it was possible to see small ripples in the loose earth beneath his feet. There were many sensory-specific spells within Camelot's magic system. They not only existed within the auxiliary types, but they also existed within the elemental types as well. Wind elemental and earth elemental spells especially had many of them for obvious reasons. Seismic wave was a 3-star magus art used for scouting with the earth element. It worked almost like echolocation, except with sensing changes in the earth rather than with sound. Several small waves were sent out that were practically imperceptible to the eye. On solid ground, there would be no visual cues at all. But, in loose ground like this, it showed up similar to the way a pond would ripple after experiencing a thrown stone. Everything within several kilometers was suddenly fed back to Lionel. There were very few limitations to seismic wave. It took very little energy to send a wave out, the only real limitation was how sharp the senses of the person sending them out was. It was said that certain animals could sense the coming of an earthquake days in advance. Such small changes could be detected by mere beasts of the third dimension. So what about Lionel? Even after reaching out 10 kilometers, Lionel still didn't feel like he had reached his limit. He had even crossed the barrier of the city in the distance. But, he shook his head and focused again. Instead of distance, he focused on depth. This required stronger waves and a bit more earth elemental force, but it was still within Lionel's ability even though his previous uses of float had almost burned him out. Simply put, thanks to his 3-star constitution, Lionel's recovery of soul force was unmatched. Lionel's breath suddenly hitched and his heart grew heavy. He had found his first dead body. His heart clenched, his hold on Aina involuntarily becoming tighter. He found another. Then another. Many of them were crushed beneath the weight of the heavy earth. Some unlucky ones were struck by heavy flying stones and trees, causing damage they couldn't live through. Some others were pierced through by errant sharp branches. Lionel continued to search, going deeper and deeper. But, somewhere deep inside, he realized that the deeper he went, the less likely he was to find someone he could save. There. There. Lionel almost cried out. Lionel found one beating heart, then another. His breathing grew quicker. This was good, some had survived. This was definitely good. As long as he helped them climb back out, their lives should be saved. Unfortunately, Lionel was a bit too naive. One of the most important aspects of war was the element of surprise. Keeping one's enemies on their toes, catching them unawares, and gaining victories for the smallest price in exchange. These were the staples of good generals. Since Terrain's city lords had planned this matter for so long, how could they be unable to predict what would happen to the landscape around them? And how could they allow that landscape to force them to give up their advantage? The sharp call of several beasts shook Lionel out of his focused state. His head tilted up into the skies, peering through the dense cloud of dirt only to barely make out a sight that made his heart tremble. Birds. Hundreds of them. Each one with a wingspan of no less than 5 meters, while some of the largest were over 20 meters in width. On their backs, each had 2 warriors. One was outfitted with a polearm weapon while the other manned a massive crossbow machine strapped to the backs of these massive birds of prey. White City was already attacking, and their first wave would be an aerial assault. Chapter 445. Lionel was instantly at a loss. If he continued saving those buried beneath the rubble, many of whom were unconscious, he would be allowing this attack to continue on smoothly. But, if he moved to stop them now, it was very likely that many of those he could save would die. Damn it. Lionel roared in his mind. Lionel. Huh. Lionel snapped out of his own thoughts. Just point out where they are to me and I'll dig them out. I can't battle in the skies like you can. Lionel opened his mouth to reply but wasn't exactly sure what to say. It would definitely be more efficient for them to be saved by him. He could use his earth elemental affinity to simply carry them out. But, Aina would have to physically dig them out. Just leave it to me. Aina insisted. More people will die than those buried down if they're allowed to go. Lionel's hesitation was broken when he heard these words. She was right. If they managed to make it to one of the baronies, hundreds would die. Aina pushed off, breaking out of Lionel's embrace and landing on the ground. They can't see me on the ground through all the dirt clouds. Stop worrying about me. Lionel blinked and nodded. The first is 57 meters in that direction and 13 meters underground. With that, Lionel shot into the skies. The formation of predatory birds soared through the skies in perfect formation. They were split into groups of 11. Each group of 11 was split into 3 groups. The first group formed the outer structure of the formation. At the helm, there was 1 bird, and following its wings there were 3 birds to each side for a total of 7 forming this outer structure. This first group formed an inverted V structure. The second group was likewise an AV structure, but they were tucked within the larger outer structure. This inner structure was formed of smaller, swifter birds, and there were just 3 of them. The final group was actually just a single bird. This bird protected the commander to the back of this double inverted V structure. In the end, from afar, it looked as though numerous triangular formations were flying through the air. They looked no different from jets shooting through the skies, all of them exuding a 4th-dimensional aura. This sort of formation should have been far beyond Lionel's means to deal with. The only reason Aina didn't stop him wasn't because she wasn't worried, but rather because she knew that trying to stop Lionel would have been useless. He was simply too fond of doing stupid things to save people he didn't even know, let alone the fact he was now doing so to protect those he thought of as his friends. In Lionel's mind, Mordred was now a close friend of his. If Camelot fell, it would be Mordred's family that suffered the most. How could he allow such a thing to happen? At the center of these numerous smaller formations, a man wearing black robes accented by white flexible armor stood atop a predator bird of his own. Unlike the others, he was the only one on the back of this bird. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his hair shaved down until only the smallest bristles remained. The rushing winds whipped against his face, but it was as though his skin was tightly stapled to his skeleton. His stern expression never distorted, nor did his eyes ever blink. He was one of City Lord White's white knights, Khaled Dior. Lionel stood in the skies, a simple, light refraction, a ray centered around him. The more he observed the coming tide of predatory birds, the more he realized he didn't stand a chance. Even ignoring the warriors and assault weapons on their backs, just the beasts alone were beyond anything Lionel had ever seen before. They had beaks that glistened like the blades of a polished spear. Their black feathers caused the light of the setting sun to rebound as though they were metal plates. Their eyes were a bright shade of crimson that exuded a bloodthirsty light as though all they knew was slaughter. As though this wasn't enough, Lionel felt that the large crossbows fitted to their backs contained much more power than 23rd century cannons. By his estimations, they were weaker than 25th century technology, but marginally stronger than 24th. And, unlike Earth's technology, they weren't negatively influenced by force in the slightest. None of this even began to touch upon the humans that managed to command these beasts and control these machines. Lionel was simply in over his head. He was still within the third dimension and he was just a single person facing almost 500. Any smart person would turn tail and run. Lionel took several deep breaths, trying to calm his beating heart. For a moment, he closed off his senses. He heard nothing, saw nothing, felt nothing. Earth was probably in chaos at this moment. Lionel could almost feel it. Everyone's lives had already been turned upside down once, but here it was again. But, he was lucky. He had talent. If he wanted to and had the time, he could gain the strength to protect himself, but not everyone could claim this. Did Lionel feel some sort of responsibility because of this? He would be lying if he said no. But, somewhere inside, he felt it was more than this. It was the same feeling he got on the football field, the same feeling he felt when he sat down at an exam, the same feeling he had when he stepped onto his first battlefield. Lionel opened his eyes, a mad grin spreading across his face as his irises flickered a wild violet red. Lionel flipped his palm, causing a familiar black rhino's horn to appear. He brought it slowly to his lips, his blood boiling and his skin flushing crimson as bronze runes danced across it. That's a nice formation you have there, would be a shame if someone ruined it. These birds might seem mighty and menacing, but these were exactly the kind of beasts most susceptible to outside influences. Seeing such odds before him only made Lionel want to win even more. It was exactly then Lionel blew on the horn with all his might, pouring his spirit pressure into it. The people of Terrain had pissed him off many times already. Lionel even believed that the so-called fugitives they had bribed Shield Cross Stars into looking for were those who wanted to blow the whistle on this maddening plan of theirs. Unfortunately, before those fugitives could do much of anything, Earth's evolution was accelerated, causing them to enter the fourth dimension before anyone predicted. Lionel remembered how he had been treated just because he was weak. He remembered how Jirak refused to tell him what they were hiding even after he spared his life. He saw the way they tried to humiliate Aina, his Aina. Since they wanted war, he would give it to them. Chapter 446. The blaring sound of a horn tore across the skies. The perfect formation of predator birds was instantly shaken. Their riders, which had spent years learning how to tame these wild beasts, were suddenly at a loss. It felt as though they were riding bucking bulls. White Knight Dior's gaze sharpened. Despite the wild reaction of his predatory bird was equally as wild, his feet remained attached as though they had been sewn together. This noise. Khaled locked onto a particular direction. Even though his eyes saw nothing in that spot, he trusted his senses. There was most definitely an enemy right there. Lionel felt the White Knight's aura lock onto him. The feeling was like being gripped by the hands of death. He knew from the very beginning that light refraction wasn't infallible. But it only made it worse now that he was funneling the abilities of this horn right toward the flock of birds. Even if the sight of him didn't give him away, the direction in which the blaring horn was coming from most definitely did. But Lionel didn't stop blowing. From behind his light refraction spell, he locked eyes with Khaled, his blood boiling. The White Knight stomped down hard on his predator bird, sending a violent shock through its body and waking it up. By now, the perfect formation had devolved into a wild flock of birds flying in every which direction. In fact, out of their control, many on the backs of these predator birds fell from their backs. Without a choice, they pulled out an inconspicuous short pole from their harnesses. With a few clicks, they became gliders. Watching so many fall from the skies, Lionel sighed a breath of relief, thinking they would have no choice but to return to White City. But, to his astonishment, as though they were assigned a life and death mission, these gliders continued forward toward their original destinations, not gazing back toward White City even once. Lionel's heart froze over. This was the first time he truly felt the resolve of these warriors. Damn it. Lionel put his horn away and pulled out his black bow and slipped on his bowman gloves. It was a palpable pressure, it was the kind Lionel hadn't felt before. In all his life, he had never faced such dauntless, fearless warriors. The demons loved war, but they still feared death. They still stormed the battlefields, but they weren't a single unit, forged together by blood and sweat. These warriors were different, though. It was impossible for them to have guessed that someone would be able to disrupt their plan before it even truly began. Yet, they reacted as though it didn't matter. Despite the fact they hadn't sensed Lionel's location like their captain had, they still traveled toward him dauntlessly, not a single one of them cowering in fear. Lionel felt like he was back on those French battlefields, facing those mortal men who threw their life away to protect their country in the face of an enemy they knew was impossible to defeat. It was on that battlefield Lionel gained respect for bravery and death. Lionel knocked his first arrow, his aura surging. Little Black Star. The little mink popped into existence out of a spinning black vortex, landing atop Lionel's head as though he had never left. Lionel's body was coated in a thin film of dancing shadows, his goldish bronze hair dancing wildly beneath his towering force. Crackling lightning, sharpening winds, dancing shadows that sounded like blades gliding across his arrow, Lionel took a deep breath and released his fingers on his exhale. As though his bow was a living entity extending from his own body, it followed his will, drawing a line from his eyes to his target. PCHU. Without ability to dodge, the first glider was pierced through the skull, but the others continued flying forward as though they hadn't sensed a thing. Lionel brought out a second arrow and fired again. Then a third. Then a fourth. In the blink of an eye, he had already sent out over a dozen arrows and reaped a dozen lives. However, he could see it all clearly. His senses were impossibly sharp, how could he miss it? Not a single one who lived flinched, not a single one thought of turning back, not a single one cowered. There were simply too many. There had only been around 500 predator birds, but each had 2 riders, making the gliders in the sky total over 1,000. Against a normal army, killing so many without giving them ability to retaliate would have caused them to stagger and run. But this army didn't seem to function by normal standards. And how could they? This wasn't a land they had come to conquer for mere wealth, this was about their lives, their future. To their backs wasn't a mere city, it was one filled with their family, their friends, those they had to protect. This wasn't a normal invading army, and the white troops of White City weren't a normal group of men and women. Lionel clenched his jaw. These were all fourth-dimensional warriors. The only reason he could kill them was because in their current positions, they had no ability to fight back. But, if he didn't put all of his strength into one arrow, he knew it would still be impossible to kill them even in this situation. He simply didn't have any large area of effect spells he could use to deal with them all at once. And, even if he did, he wouldn't have enough spirit pressure to easily affect such a large area without all but killing himself. As though the situation wasn't bad enough already, it only got worse in the next instant. White Knight Daoist had locked onto Lionel's general location long ago. Yet, despite knowing his men were dying one after another, he still hadn't made a move against Lionel. And the reason for this soon became clear, quell your rage. A booming voice shocked the wild flock of predator birds. Lionel's heart trembled. The birds. It seemed that White Knight Daoist wasn't designated as the head of this aerial squad without reason. The disordered, wild flock of predator birds suddenly regained their purpose, their crimson eyes all locking onto a certain direction. Lionel's blood ran cold. Chapter 447. The feeling of hundreds locking onto you, each without any other expressed goal than to taste your blood and reap your life. It was something Lionel had experienced before within the Merlin trials. But there was something different about facing so many beasts. They didn't have a semblance of humanity, not an ounce of reason. There were no words he could use to get them to pause, nor were there any looming timers or rules he could use to pull himself out of this situation. It couldn't have been a more primal sense of fight or flight. It was either he defeated all of these enemies or escaped them, if not, he would die. Lionel suddenly felt a wave of interference play against his light refraction spell, distorting it. In the blink of an eye, it became a useless decoy hanging in the skies, exposing him to the senses of thousands. A shudder ran through Lionel's spine. This hadn't happened because he was careless or even because he had run out of energy. This was an ability. The birds. All this time Lionel had had the thought of being careful at the back of his mind. Though it was somewhat more difficult for a unit of warriors to use their abilities as freely in such a structure where the power of the whole was more important than the individual, Lionel knew that unexpected abilities were one of the things he had to pay attention to the most. In this aspect, Lionel was perfectly correct. The actions of White Knight Daoist proved as much without a shadow of a doubt. What Lionel didn't expect, however, was for the abilities of the predator birds to be maybe even more important. All this time, Lionel had been so focused on their menacing exteriors that he never considered the fact their internal abilities were what truly should have struck fear in him. Lionel rapidly retreated, placing his body almost parallel to the ground as his jet-black surfboard sent him soaring backward. He quickly pulled out the dictionary, using the base of the surfboard to hide his actions. Those birds, what are they and what are their abilities? *ping**, replying to Seed. These birds are a subspecies of specially bred decoder beasts known as the jagged beak predator ravens. They are known for two main abilities, one related to their oddly shaped beaks and the second related to their pupils. Jagged beak, ability to disrupt force organization, predator pupils, ability to disrupt force organization. Lionel's heart trembled. The drawing of force arts was a delicate operation. Every force art type was a different language that spoke in a different way. But, in order to convey a certain message, it had to be exceptionally particular. This much was proved by when Lionel modified Camelot's force art in order to draw them faster. Doing just this small action caused the strength of these force arts to plummet. This was all to say something very simple. If these predator ravens could disrupt the organization of force arts, then spells were all but useless against them. Lionel now understood why it was that these birds were sent as the centerpiece of the first attack. Any large-scale formations Camelot wanted to put up to protect themselves would be absolutely useless before them. Even though the predator pupils were weaker than their jagged beaks in formation breaking, when 500 of them stared at a single point, what chance did a formation stand? And, beyond that, what if they began attacking that already weakened point with their beaks? Kwa-ah. Kwa-ah. Lionel's expression changed. His internal sight swept out, only to find that the distance between him and the flock of predator ravens had already halved. Their speed was inconceivable and clearly far beyond what his surfboard could muster. Maybe if it wasn't for the heavy crossbows still strapped to their backs, they would be even faster. Lionel locked eyes with the commander in the midst. He still stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back and his black robes fluttering wildly beneath the speed of his predator raven. In truth, White Knight Daoist was inwardly surprised despite his indifferent expression. For one, he recognized Lionel. They would be foolish to not know of the talents of Earth before coming to invade them, but even beyond that, even if it wasn't about invading Earth, he would have heard of Lionel. After all, the rumors of him joining Valiant Heart Mountain without having to pass the trials had already spread like wildfire. But this was only a secondary reasoning. What shocked him the most was that despite 500 predator ravens locking onto Lionel at once, all they managed to do was distort Lionel's spell. Had it not been for Lionel dispelling the mage art himself, Khaled might still be looking toward a distorted image of Lionel. The White Knight narrowed his eyes. This was good. Now that Earth had evolved into a fourth-dimensional world, those who were born within it should be experiencing a evolutionary growing phase right now. Within the next few weeks to months, many of Earth's greatest talents would experience explosive growth in their abilities. This was why it was so important for them to be swift in their approach. This wasn't only about keeping the element of surprise, but it was also about ensuring that Earth didn't get any more chances to grow. Earth didn't have the foundation of cultivation. All they could rely on was technology and their gifted abilities. The evolution to the fourth dimension would already guarantee the near uselessness of technology, so they only had the latter to worry about. With a talent like Lionel before him, how could Khaled possibly allow him to live? Lionel was most definitely one of the greatest roadblocks standing between them and claiming this world for themselves. How fair was it for Earth to have so much potential and for terrain to have reached the end of its own? How fair was it for them to have to scratch and claw for everything while the people of Earth could be gifted the world? How fair was it for them to have to deal with people of their own world that would rather be the dogs of others rather than forging something for themselves? The truth was that there was no fairness in the world. Since that was the case, they would snatch what should be theirs themselves. And in White Knight Dior's mind, killing Lionel was the first step. Swarm him to death. Chapter 448. Lionel's feet shifted, slowing his black surfboard to a grinding halt. He pulled out the horn once again, but Khaled only sneered. Seeing his reaction, Lionel put the horn away without even blowing on it. Now that he understood the situation he was in, his mind flowed like water, jumping from idea to idea without pause or rest. It was already impossible for him to stop the gliders, but he had at least bought the baronies and Camelot time. By now, information about what was happening here should have long since been disseminated. A city falling from the sky was not something that could be missed, and Lionel had made certain of that. Lionel's goal had already changed. Assuming that he would be able to stop an entire army by himself had been foolish. Since he knew that he couldn't, he would focus on what he could do. His first priority was to survive. His second priority would be to kill this commander. Though Lionel set this second priority, he didn't spend any of his time hoping for it. He could sense that this commander was much stronger than he was. At his current level, Lionel couldn't even deal with the likes of Jilnia and those heirs of powers with any sort of assurance. At most, he could deal with exceptionally weak fourth-dimensional existences and those who couldn't defend themselves like those gliders. But, against someone like White Knight Dior, well, it was safe to say that if this battle was happening on the ground and not the air where Khaled could not directly track down and kill Lionel himself, Lionel would likely already be dead. Lionel's emotions seemed to vanish, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto the flock of birds around him as though he could no longer sense the gliders flying by below him. His mind reached an unprecedented sense of calm and seriousness that made the White Knight frown for the first time since this battle began. Lionel stood absolutely still in the air. Using his flying treasure as his base, he knocked another arrow, his breathing calm and steady. The way his eyes locked onto White Knight Dior made the latter feel as though there was nothing else around them, as though in this world there were only the two of them, as though if he made the slightest mistake, miscalculated just the smallest bit, that his life would be over. A halo of bronze appeared above Lionel's head, wafting out a majestic violet fog. It seemed to coat Lionel in the air of a king, even causing the atmosphere to become several times heavier. In the past, the gravity field ability of Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor had been exceptionally weak, barely increasing the gravity by a few percentage points, if that. But, after absorbing so much herb essence, just the presence of Lionel's halo alone increased it by 20%, giving a 1.2x effect at no expense to Lionel's own stamina. This might not seem like much, but aerial beasts were especially reliant on their light weight. Small changes could cost them a drastic amount of speed. And, at this moment, Lionel would take whatever advantage he could get. Shoo! A predator raven swooped down at Lionel, its eyes a furious shade of crimson. But, almost in the exact instant it reached the range in order to do this, Lionel had reacted first, letting loose an arrow. Kwawa! Kwawa! An arc of blood sprayed from the predator raven's eyes. It sprawled in the air, its wings flapping about so wildly that it lost several feathers in a matter of moments. Lionel's surfboard moved at his command. He seemed to move in a straight line, but the angles he took were just out of reach of several predator ravens. Without any long-ranged attacks, these ravens could only assault Lionel with their beaks and their claws. Their pupils were also useless if Lionel wasn't casting any spells. Though they could disrupt the organization of force, that was all. They couldn't dispel force or negate it. This meant that against force arts, their abilities were exceptional. But, against normal force attacks like Lionel's reinforced arrows, the amount of change they could cause was next to zero. To make matters worse for the flock of predator ravens, their size was simply too big. With only short-ranged attacks available to them and even the smallest of them having a wingspan of 5 meters, nimble movements were most definitely not their forte. In fact, even if it was, with how many of them had swarmed Lionel, sudden bursts of movement would cause more problems to themselves than they would to Lionel himself. Khaled narrowed his eyes. He thought that since he was facing a child, all he had to do was intimidate Lionel into making a stupid mistake with the use of his overwhelming numbers. He thought that Lionel wouldn't have the presence of mind to realize that he was keeping the predator ravens spaced out so that they wouldn't collide with one another. Yet, not only had Lionel realized this, he realized it immediately and even boldly acted upon it, even to the point of allowing the flock of ravens to surround him. If things kept going like this, without the room to even turn around, they would end up flying by Lionel and ironically letting him escape. But, Khaled wasn't a fool. In fact, he was one of City Lord White's most trusted white knights. If not for this, how could he be allowed to man one of their most important missions? Disperse! He commanded calmly. In one swift motion, the predator ravens that had already passed Lionel by flapped their wings and spread out. Instantly, they had formed a large encirclement of Lionel, effectively cutting off the surrounding 500-meter space for their battlefield. Those ravens that were still surging toward Lionel spread their wings out wide, coming to grinding halts as they either shot up or down. Despite feeling that he could kill Lionel with a single strike if he got the opportunity, Khaled remained calm, retreating as well. In the center of it all that was left were a group of 3 predator ravens, the smallest and swiftest of them all, assaulting Lionel from all sides. Khaled's response immediately cured all of his formation's weaknesses. He had expected Lionel's calm expression to crack, but to his surprise, there wasn't even the slightest shift. From start to finish, Lionel had only shot a single arrow. The rest of the time, he spent calculating the safest lines of trajectory he would take to dodge around these beasts. Well, that was at least what it seemed like. But, Lionel's real target had been his target from the very beginning. A particular bird beast that now had just a single eye and was in much too much pain to follow Khaled's orders perfectly. Chapter 449. Khaled's expression changed. He had already commanded that predator raven to man the perimeter, but it hadn't listened. No, it's not that it wasn't listening, something's making it not listen. This boy. Lionel had realized long ago that Khaled's commands could be interrupted. For Khaled to have been sent to command this aerial assault, it was likely that other than gaining City Lord White's trust, it was also due to his ability. By virtue of this, it was easy to extrapolate that Khaled had likely been the one in command of the predator birds from the very beginning. After Lionel realized this, he already had all the information he needed. The fact that his horn could disrupt Khaled's control, even for a moment, meant that it was very much possible for external sources to do so. So, the simple question was, what about pain? This much was easily confirmed. Though it was just for a moment, the predator raven completely disregarded Khaled's commands, almost completely disrupting the formation with its erratic flight in those moments just after Lionel pierced its eye. Though Khaled managed to regain control of the predator raven, there was one thing he didn't notice. Or, rather, two things packaged into one. The first thing was that Lionel had hidden a secondary damage spell within an arrow. And the second thing was that Lionel had hidden a smaller version of the force arts drawn onto his horn as well. The instant he realized that his hypothesis was correct, he activated the secondary damage spell, causing the raven a surge of pain once again. And, right afterward, he activated the beast-taming force arts to disrupt Khaled's second attempts at controlling the raven. When Lionel's light refraction spell was influenced, he realized a few things. For one, the influence of a single raven's pupils were exceptionally weak on him. If it wasn't for 500 disrupting his spell at once, it would have never distorted in the first place. And second, when he used his surfboard to block the view of Khaled while he pulled out the dictionary, he realized that the effect the ravens had on him were much weaker in that instant. That obviously meant that their abilities weren't area of effect, but rather truly reliant on their sight. At the very least, they had to have a line of sight to the force art they wanted to disrupt. This made Lionel realize his second very important thing. These damned birds couldn't disrupt a force art that had already been shielded and definitely couldn't disrupt one too small for them to lock eyes on. At this point, though Khaled was startled, he still didn't understand what Lionel's plan was. He could tell that something was interrupting his control and that this thing was most definitely the arrow still lodged in the raven's eye. But, what was the purpose? There were over 500 jagged-beaked predator ravens, all of which had long since surrounded Lionel and were waiting to taste his blood. What good was there to mess with just a single one? But, Khaled's expression changed again when Lionel abruptly changed directions to, seemingly by coincidence, cross paths with the erratically flying bird. With a flip of his palm, Lionel's bow disappeared, only to be replaced by a pitch-black spear. Clang! 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 Chain domain. The predator raven was suddenly tightly bound in the sky, its wings pinned to body and its claws pressed flush against itself. Veins popped out across Lionel's forehead, but he didn't retreat. His back flexed as the predator raven hung in the air beneath his might. He could see its enraged eyes trying to bore into his soul. One was a blood red while the other dripped with crimson, its precious life dripping to the ground far beneath them. However, when it saw Lionel's cold, calculating eyes looking back toward it, the bird felt fear for the first time in maybe its life. It suddenly stopped struggling, its blood running cold. In a lot of ways, beasts were just more of what humans were innately but tried to hide. Their sense of strict hierarchy was even more damning, even more rigorous, even more demanding. When facing a being superior to you, beasts lowered their heads, even if it meant certain death. Lionel's spear shot into the predator raven's eye, an undeniable callousness in his gaze as he felt his blade run deep into its skull and through its brain. Spear force burst out, mincing the insides of the predator raven in an instant. But, it was what happened next that made Khaled's heart truly seize. Lionel pulled out his spear, blood spraying through the air as he thrust forth once more. But this time, his target wasn't the dead raven but rather the crossbow machine strapped to its back. The strap was severed in a single strike, separating out from the predator ravens. Lionel's chain domain released the beast but latched onto the crossbow, causing it float before him in menacing fashion. Just like that, in what felt like the blink of an eye, the entire situation had shifted. All around, there were hundreds of predator ravens, each outfitted with a crossbow, but not a single one with the capability of firing one. And then there was Lionel. He was just one man, but he had suddenly become the center of the battlefield. His gaze still cool, suffused with indifference, he used his chain domain to load the first bolt, his eyes locking onto Khaled once more. A wave of danger seized the heart of the White Knight. Before, he felt his movements were clever. Clearing out the predator ravens to surround and suffocate Lionel seemed to have been the perfect move at the time. But now, he felt as though he had co-signed his own death. The irony of it was that as a commander, he didn't even have a crossbow of his own. The indifference in Lionel's gaze was almost beginning to drive Khaled mad. There was no sense of achievement or victory or even complacency or happiness in his eyes. It was as though what hovered before him wasn't a human, but rather a series of data points to be callously observed. And then Lionel released the bolt. Shoo! Bang! The sound barrier shattered in an instant. It happened so quickly that by the time it was registered, Khaled was already trying to dodge out of the way. But, unfortunately for the White Knight, Lionel's target was never him. KWWAA, it was a devastating sight. The cry of the raven hardly sounded before its head imploded into fleshly bits of crimson gore. The bolt was so powerful that it continued without losing momentum, piercing through the heart of another raven several hundred meters behind the first and causing it to implode as well. White Knight Dyer found himself falling through the skies, a half-stunned expression on his face. He lost? Lionel looked on from up above, his gaze locking onto Khaled's falling figure as his chain domain adjusted the aim of the crossbow toward the White Knight. Today, he would send a resounding message to the people of Terrain. Chapter 450. Khaled felt his heart seize. Something told him that no matter what he did, it would be impossible to dodge out of the way of this strike. The White Knight roared at the top of his lungs, unleashing all the force he had. There was simply no point in keeping anything in reserve. What good was reserve strength if he was dead? He didn't bother to pull out his glider. At this moment, he didn't want anything slowing his descent toward the ground. In fact, the faster he hit the ground, the better. As for whether he could survive such an impact, he would deal with just a single problem at a time. Bang! The sound barrier shattered. Roaring winds shot in every direction, clearing out a path for the released bolt. It felt for a moment as though it was cleaving the clouds with a single sword strike. Khaled flipped a palm, causing a spear to appear. He poured all of his force into it, striking out with all the might he could muster as he fell from the skies. At the same time, he kicked hard at the air, flipping himself upside down to careen toward the ground even faster. He hoped that the fact he was falling in the same direction as the bolt along with the fact he was putting his all into stopping it would dampen the strength somewhat. But, reality was cruel. Though he was correct in his assessment, the diminishment in strength was practically negligible. Khaled's spear point met the bolt, his eyes practically bulging out of their sockets under his strain. In that moment, he could swear that he had never put so much strength into a strike before. But his spear point splintered apart like dried weed. The bolt continued forward as though cutting through air, blasting a bloody hole so large in his shoulder that it took his arm along with it. White Knight Dyer paled. His arm spun aimlessly in the air, sparkling droplets of crimson dancing around it. It looked as if a cannonball had taken a quarter of his body with it, trying its very best to reap his life. In that moment, his spinning arm was sheared apart by the harsh winds left trailing the bolt. Had it not been for the force Khaled had protecting his body, his head might have suffered the same force. Lionel coldly looked on from above, knocking another bolt. His senses swept over it all. It seemed that every crossbow had only been outfitted with 3 bolts. But, judging by their strength, Lionel understood why. With such devastating power, it was unlikely for any formation to survive the combination of the Predator Raven's abilities and this crossbow assault. In addition, weight was a huge issue when it came to such an aerial assault, and each one of these bolts rivaled even the crossbow itself in heft. But just one more bolt was fine. Since Khaled had given him such an opening, Lionel didn't believe he wouldn't be able to kill him. Lionel coldly aimed for the last time, watching the White Knight's falling figure. At that moment, several of the Predator Ravens had swarmed once again, trying to obstruct Lionel's sight toward their commander. But Lionel didn't flinch. If Khaled thought that he would lose sight because of this, he was sorely mistaken. From start to finish, Lionel's internal sight had been completely locked onto Khaled. Beyond this, would the bolt really be stopped by just a few bodies considering its strength? Lionel's chest expanded with an even breath. As though he was sinking with the crossbow, he released the moment he began to exhale, his calm breathing contrasting with the shattering boom of the bolt's speed. Qua! The bolt instantly tore through 3 raven bodies in the blink of an eye, showering the skies in crimson. Panic gripped Khaled's heart. He continuously kicked the air, trying to quicken his descent. Every time he did, he left concentric circles in the sky, accelerating himself downward with each attempt. But the bolt was simply too fast. He realized at that point that obstructing Lionel's vision had been useless. In fact, using so many ravens to block him only gave him easy access to more bolts. A strong feeling of helplessness gripped at Khaled's heart, but his expression remained the same as all others who had died to Lionel's hand on this day. He looked up toward his murderer, his gaze locking onto Lionel's. All he received in return was a plain stare, the same one that told him he was nothing but a data point, the same one that didn't seem to care for who he was as a person. Shoo! Bang! There was no sound when the bolt shot through Khaled's chest. In fact, it seemed as though the bolt had only flown through another patch of air. Rather, the huge crashing sound came from the bolt colliding with the ground and leaving a crater that rivaled the impact of a small meteor. For a moment, there was only a bloody hole. And in the next, Khaled's body imploded, shattering from the inside out into a rain of blood and gore. Having realized he made another mistake by calling the ravens to come and protect him, Khaled didn't bother to protect himself in the end, opting to simply stare at the man who ended his life. It was the kind of look only a man dauntless of death could form in his final moments. Maybe, from the very beginning, Khaled's anxiousness, his panic, his trembling, never had anything to do with the danger his life was in and everything to do with his unwillingness to fail the mission he was given. Lionel took a deep breath before releasing the crossbow in his chain domain and gasping for breath. He coughed several times, his lungs screaming beneath the strain. Yip! Yip! Lionel's chest heaved as he tried to give the little mink a reassuring smile. Calculating the trajectory of such a fast bolt hadn't been a problem for Lionel. Others couldn't guarantee such accuracy and could only use these crossbows as siege weapons, but Lionel was different. This was all to say that the reason for his fatigue wasn't this, but rather his use of his chain domain. But, it couldn't be helped, his surfboard couldn't fit such a large, heavy crossbow onto it. Lionel shook his head, turning his gaze toward where the gliders had disappeared to. By now, they were definitely closing in on the first barony. Even without the predator ravens, that city didn't stand a chance against so many fourth-dimensional existences. Damn it. Chapter 451. Lionel was just one person. Before he even battled White Knight Daoist, he had already tired his mind using so many wind spells. After this battle, he was even more spent. Lionel finally steadied his breathing and looked around at what was left of the predator ravens. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't have an easy method of controlling these beasts. His horn was designed for third-dimensional beasts. But, even then, he couldn't precisely control those third-dimensional beasts. He could only rile them up into a frenzy and give them simple commands like pointing out a target to trample and targets to avoid like he had done in his final battle on Camelot. This time, what Lionel had done was even simpler. He poured his dream force into the horn in order to influence these massive predator birds. Essentially, he forced them into temporary madness, and this was the extent of his abilities. Plus, even if Lionel could make use of these birds, he wouldn't dare to. Believing that White City only had a single method of controlling these ravens would be absolutely foolish. If Lionel brought these birds into battle and they were suddenly turned against him, that would be the worst kind of mistake. Such a thing could completely turn the tide of battle. That said, Lionel also couldn't allow White City to so easily gain back these beasts for nothing. Lionel was absolutely certain that the loss of 500 of these predator ravens would sting for them. But, how could he easily get rid of them? Lionel's eyes flashed. Little Black Star. Yip! Yip! The little mink launched himself off of Lionel's head, diving down and through the skies. It quickly came back with a shadow ball it eagerly swallowed from the top of Lionel's head. Lionel nodded. Though he had to dispel Little Blackstar's sharpening ability, which had come in very useful several times already, he had no choice but to make a sacrifice in this matter. Command them to battle to the death, Lionel said. Yip. Yip. Lionel didn't have the heart to monitor such a scene, so he allowed the little mink to oversee it as he descended from the skies. By now, Aina had dug up several dozen knights, most of whom were heavily injured and unconscious. Lionel frowned because he didn't see Lancelot among them. It can't be that Lancelot really died, right? In the beginning, Lionel had been paying attention so that he could direct Aina. But, after a while, he had to completely focus on the battle, so he sent all the locations at once and focused his everything on Khaled. Aina raised her brows when Lionel appeared. You're fine? Did you ever doubt it? Lionel asked with a grin. Seeing that Lionel was in the mood to lighten the atmosphere, Aina felt a weight on her chest lower. Her senses weren't as powerful as Lionel's. So, through the dust cloud, she couldn't really see or feel what Lionel was facing. She felt somewhat better knowing that it couldn't have been too dangerous, then. Of course, had she known the truth, let alone feeling relief now, she wouldn't have even allowed Lionel to go. But as the saying goes, ignorance is bliss. Seemingly realizing Aina's line of thinking, Lionel frowned. What happened to your sense-boosting treasure? Lionel remembered that Aina had used one of her quasi-bronze rewards from the Joan Zone on a headpiece that covered her one weakness. But, ever since they reunited, Lionel hadn't seen it again. Even to the current Lionel, a quasi-bronze treasure was a big deal. Currently, he only had one broken one he had yet to repair, while the second was his force-crafting quill. Losing such a treasure was definitely a big deal. That. Aina hesitated. She seemed to flash back to memories she didn't quite want to remember. Lionel's frown deepened when he saw Aina's reaction. Just what happened to her on terrain, exactly? It seemed as though every time he got close to touching upon it, she would pull back. Lionel never pressed Aina to tell him anything, especially when it was related to her family. But, he didn't have any reason to believe that this was related to the Brazinger family, and he was serious about the words he had spoken to her before. He wanted Aina to lean and rely on him. But, if she never opened up to him, such a thing would be impossible. Though Lionel had taken Mordred's advice and stopped being a pansy, if he was always the only one pushing, even he could grow tired of such a thing. I lost it to an invalid. Lionel's eyes widened. What? Lionel panicked slightly, taking a step toward Aina as though he wanted to check if she was injured anywhere. It was completely irrational considering this must have happened months ago, but he couldn't help himself. The invalid Aina must be referring to was most definitely from terrain. Any invalid that had lasted so long on an old world was powerful beyond Lionel's imagining. One had to remember that invalids were only born from those who failed to awaken their abilities. They couldn't be birthed from those who succeeded, nor could they reproduce amongst themselves. This meant that the same population of invalids a world produced in the very beginning would be the very same population of invalids they had until the day the world died or all the invalids were eliminated. There were very few, exceptionally rare exceptions to this rule. Any instances that could break this rule would be cherished by invalids all over. Though terrain was weak, it was still a world with hundreds of years of history within the fourth dimension. This meant that any invalid Aina ran into was definitely at least that old. And, at such an age, the likelihood that they'd be a variant invalid shot through the roof. Lionel held on to Aina's shoulders, his heart beating even more wildly than when he had been battling a white knight far beyond him in strength. He truly felt like he had almost lost Aina forever. Just what happened, exactly? Chapter 452. Seeing Lionel's reaction, Aina didn't know how to react herself for a long while. The level of worry in his gaze, even for something that had long since passed, left her feeling at a loss. It wasn't a big deal, I'm here, aren't I? Lionel frowned at this response. He could sense Aina pulling away. Such a scene made him sigh and release his grip on her. Where is Lancelot? Did you not find him? Lionel changed the topic, but this left Aina at even more of a loss. Forcing things and reaching the end goal as quickly as possible always seemed like the path with the most satisfaction. A slow, long grind wasn't something most people wanted to deal with, and it was even something that scared most away. Though Lionel had spoken so many heartfelt words to Aina, they were ultimately words he had spoken himself. They weren't words that Aina had said, nor were they necessarily the way she, herself, felt. Whether she did or not wasn't something Lionel knew, nor was it quite the point regardless of what the truth was. What truly mattered was that even if she did, she wasn't at a point where she was ready to say them. This wasn't necessarily the end of the world. The pursuit of Aina had always been a one-person affair. Lionel never took Aina's standoffishness to heart because in his mind, it was his task to get her to warm up to him. If he failed, then it was because he was inadequate, it wasn't her fault. But this very same logical mind of Lionel's also understood that relationships weren't supposed to work in this way. As logical as he was, he also had exceptionally high emotional intelligence. He felt that his and Aina's relationship had taken a step forward she very clearly wasn't ready for. When things reached such a point, dragging her along would do more harm than good. However, this abrupt change in Lionel from overly caring to, as though he had flipped a switch, strictly business. It left Aina not knowing how to face him. Maybe for the first time, she realized just how true Lionel's words from before were. He didn't lie to her, there was no hidden truth she had to uncover, he laid out the way his mind worked and the kind of person he was right before her. Lionel might have been kind and caring, but it was all built upon a foundation of cold calculation. What drove him first and foremost was logic. Since he decided Aina wasn't ready to truly treat him as her boyfriend, he took a step back with ease, almost too much ease. Watching it all play out exactly how Lionel described left Aina feeling somewhat cold. She realized that if there really came a day where she didn't trust him, where she didn't lean on him as he would lean on her, he really wouldn't come to save her. Aina's lips trembled, but she clenched her jaw and swallowed hard, forcing back the emotions she was feeling and not allowing her tears to fall. Her small reactions were missed by Lionel, who had started to analyze the fallen knights, calculating if he could spare the stamina to heal them and by how much he would be able to do so. While I was digging up the others, Lancelot managed to climb back up himself. He gathered the ones who could still fight and rushed off to the Lin barony. If it wasn't ruined, they plan on taking a shortcut to the backside of the barony and hopefully help fortify their defenses. Lionel raised his brows when he heard these words, looking back toward Aina. By now, she had already gone back to normal as though nothing had happened. They have a chance to make it before the gliders get there. Though the gliders had a head start and were flying through the skies, because they were gliding rather than truly flying, their speed was obviously lacking. Lionel doubted that the loss of their commander would slow them by much. Such organized armies definitely had a clear line of succession. Those who were meant to step up had likely already done so. Lionel wouldn't underestimate such an army in the slightest. Did they describe the shortcut to you? Lionel asked. Aina shook her head no. Lionel could only accept this. He hadn't been too hopeful to begin with. There was no time to do such a thing. And, even if there was no guarantee the explanations would have been clear enough to make use of them. Yip. Yip. At that moment, little Blackstar dove down from the skies, skipping on his little shadowy platforms to dive into Aina's arms. Lionel smiled lightly. Done? Yip. Yip. Lionel nodded. Pass me their beast crystals and crossbows, they might be useful in the future. Yip. Yip. Little Blackstar vanished into Lionel's spatial ring and entered the segmented cube with ease. Sometimes Lionel wondered if the little guy had a spatial affinity rather than a dark elemental affinity. But, he knew better. Though they looked quite similar in function, they were very different. Those with space elemental affinities were moving through space, whereas little Blackstar was entering and exiting the shadow world. They were functionally the same, but technically different. After transferring all the beast crystals and crossbows from his shadow world and into the lab setting, the little mink dove out and back into Aina's embrace. Lionel looked over the knights again and cast a quick, grand heal, a few times. When he was sure that none of their lives were in danger and that a few would wake up soon, he called down his jet black surfboard again. Stepping onto it, Lionel turned a light smile toward Aina and stretched out a hand. Aina was a bit stunned, but still reached out. "Hang on tight," Lionel said, wrapping an arm around her waist. Aina subconsciously wrapped her arms around Lionel's back as they shot into the skies. "Yip! Yip!" The little mink called out in dissatisfaction, feeling squished. Without a choice, the little guy could only wiggle out and find a new location within the segmented cube. Maybe going to tease Tolliver would make it feel better. Aina, however, looked up to view of Lionel's side profile. Realizing that he wasn't paying attention to her, she lowered her head back into his chest. A single tear fell from her eyes, but just as quickly as it appeared, it was absorbed by Lionel's robes. Chapter 453. Camelot suffered a great blow on the first day. White City's assault was swift and didn't contain the slightest hint of mercy. By the time Lionel and Aina made it to the city, it was already under siege by those over 1,000 gliders. Realizing it was a lost cause, rather than trying to fight a losing battle, Lancelot focused all his efforts on retreat, evacuating as many as he could. Lionel and Aina of course spent their time helping these efforts. Though Lionel had the crossbows now, he could at most shoot a single one at a time. This was the limitation of his chain domain. Even when he wasn't in the skies, he realized that the trouble loading the crossbows was greater than he originally thought. The amount of strength it took was astronomical and beyond him. One solution to this was to rely on Aina to do this, but then came the problem of aiming. Only Lionel could make a siege weapon like those massive crossbows accurate enough to target single individuals. Even if Aina loaded the crossbows for him, he would still need to aim them. And he could obviously only aim a single one at a time due to the limitations of his chain domain. A target was always changing and shifting their position. Lionel couldn't possibly expect to aim so many crossbows at once with such a blatant weakness. And aiming just one and firing a single bolt at a time couldn't possibly allow him to stop an army of over 1,000, especially with how dauntless they were. It was better to keep the crossbows as a trump card for the future. Lionel even thought it might be nice to spend some time modifying them to make them easier to use. With his current strength, his imprint on this war definitely wouldn't be made by his fists. If he wanted to have an impact, it would definitely have to be with his crafts. Lionel returned to Camelot to find the dark atmosphere he had originally seen had become even heavier. What no one could have possibly expected was for a new enemy to appear before they even finished dealing with the Empire. Not only was this enemy more cruel than the Empire, but they even seemed to be more powerful. Lionel and Aina were eventually led to their rooms. But, who knows if Mordred got to the organizers or not, but it was once again just a singular room. Lionel swept a glance around. Though the room was just as if not more luxurious than the one Mordred had given them, it was levels lower in romantic hues. In such a situation, it felt difficult not to read more into this than one should. Rather than warm lavender, red and violet colors, it had a bland whiteness to it. And, instead of a refreshing, soothing scent, the room didn't have a particular smell to it at all. The neutrality of it all hung with an odd heaviness. Well, this was the case to Aina. For Lionel, he didn't feel any particular way, as though he had already disconnected himself from it all. With a flip of his palm, the segmented cube appeared and expanded to its 5 by 5 by 5 meter size. Despite its size, it only took up about 20% of the large room. If you want to use the cleansing waters, you can. It should be easy for you to enter, just reach out with your internal sight. I'm going to go and see if I can gather any materials from Camelot's warehouses. If I can't, I'll also speak to M to see if the Demon Empire has the things I need. Materials? Aina asked softly. Emicham, Lionel nodded. I'm not very powerful now, so all I can do is make things with my hands. If there's an opportunity, they'll make a replacement for the headpiece you lost. You're a force crafter? Aina's soft voice carried a hint of surprise. Lionel grinned. How is it? Pretty amazing, right? Lionel's smile seemed to light up the room. Though this space already had plenty of sunlight rebounding off its white walls, it lacked the same warmth. Aina didn't move even a long while after Lionel had left. Eventually, she walked slowly to the bed, crawling onto its head and pulling her knees into her chest. A touch of redness crept onto her nose as her eyes watered. She stared off into empty space, seemingly looking at nothing and thinking of nothing. But the emotions threatening to spill over were undeniable. She squeezed her knees tighter. At first it seemed as though she was simply in an emotional state, but soon, it reached beyond that. The crackling of bones sounded in the quiet room. It took only a moment for one to realize that the bones that were breaking were Aina's own. As quickly as she broke them, she healed them, only for her to fracture them once more. In any other context, this was just training taken to an extreme. Breaking down one's body and reforming it was the simplest form of training. However, within context, it felt like something much darker, like a heavy fog hanging over a young woman's life. A person's worst enemy could often be themselves. In the beginning, it might have seemed that Lionel was the only one who needed to grow and to mature, but it was easy to forget that Aina, too, was just an 18-year-old girl. Aina grew up alone. Under the welfare of the Empire, most in thanks to her 5-star professional evaluation, she was never homeless nor starving. But, regardless, she was alone. She didn't meet Yuri until the later years of her middle school days and always had trouble connecting with her or anyone, for that matter. She was stuck in a quagmire of her own thoughts. Even if she wanted to connect with someone, she had no idea how to. Aina continued to stare off into blank space, her tears half fallen, but not quite, her emotions half spoken, but not quite, her heart half broken, but not quite. Chapter 454. You want to enter our treasure vaults? Arthur's lip twitched as he looked toward Lionel. What kind of king would allow someone not even of their kingdom to randomly enter their vaults and choose as they please? Even if one was a loyal citizen, it might only be possible to enter once every several years to pick out one or two things. Yet, not only was Lionel asking for free rein to do as he pleased, he wasn't even a person of Camelot. Despite this, Arthur felt like he couldn't say no. Maybe aside from him and a few founding members of Camelot, Lionel had done more for the kingdom than anyone else. And, beyond that, Lionel was the reason he felt happier now than he had in a very long time. He had even managed to have dinner with his daughter just last night. Of course, Arthur didn't say these things aloud. After all, he had just lost a fifth of his kingdom and was in line to lose much more of it before all of this was over. Plus, many of his citizens were in danger. But, after making his decision, he had already been ready to lose everything. So, how much of a need was there for him to care about such a loss? Yes. Lionel smiled and nodded as though it wasn't a big deal. Are you trying to extort me, kid? Exactly. PFT, King Arthur's head snapped in a particular direction. But, by the time he locked eyes on his son, Lionel was already looking off into the distance as though nothing had happened. Nice weather we're having, huh? Lionel rubbed his nose, scanning the room. Unfortunately for his act, the only window in the throne room was exceptionally high up and was angled such that it only shone a small light on the throne itself. So, how could he possibly know with any sort of detail the kind of weather they were having? King Arthur shook his head. Lionel had always been so obedient. He couldn't help but feel that Lionel was having a bad influence on his son. At this point, Lionel's smile faded somewhat and he became more serious. Arthur, I've told him this already, but you should be aware as well. If you don't want to lose too much of your power after submitting to the Empire, what's important is to show your worth. Repelling this invasion is a great opportunity for you. Since Terrain dares to do this, they're confident. I'm certain that they've scouted out Earth and understand more about our world than even maybe we do. The Empire will definitely be in trouble and terrain definitely won't stop until they claim the world for themselves. The greatest variable in this war is you all, Camelot and the Demon Empire. Terrain? King Arthur raised an eyebrow. You seem to know a lot about these enemies? Not a lot, just more than most. And you believe that by opening up the vaults to you our likelihood of winning will be greater? Exponentially so. And how am I supposed to make certain that you aren't embezzling anything? Lionel blinked and smiled once more. You don't. Just take it as my worker's fee. Shameless. These are your vaults? Lionel raised his brows in surprise. Leonis smiled. Yes, this should be the greatest treasure store on Camelot. The only rival to us might be Big Sister's empire. The area was much larger than anything he expected. The vaults were located on the basement floor of the castle. And, despite the size of the castle itself, it took up several floors, a whole 3 levels to be exact. The amount of space totaled up to more than a square kilometer. It was absolutely inconceivable that there would actually be enough treasure to fill it all up with. The first floor was filled with stacks of gold coins. Lionel felt as though he had walked into a dragon's den. He was certain that just the existence of this place was a huge hazard. If one of these gold piles slipped, it could easily bury someone alive. Still, Lionel wasn't very interested in these piles of gold. On Earth, gold had lost its value a long time ago. Other than being a good conductor, it wasn't very useful otherwise. It was too soft of a metal and not very good for weapons or armors. It was unfortunate for Camelot, but it seemed that in any places other than their kingdom, this first floor of treasures was quite useless. However, there were 2 more floors below this one. This, Lionel didn't know what to say for a long time. The store of ores seemed endless. They piled up into what seemed like perpetuity. Though most were pseudo-4th-dimensional ores, their value was so much greater than the gold on the first level that they couldn't even be properly compared. It felt like blasphemy to do so. And here Lionel thought he was somewhat of a tycoon after mining the hive, only to find out that he was still very much a poor man if he was comparing himself to a true kingdom. But this made sense. Camelot had existed as a pseudo-4th-dimensional world for a very long time. Over the years, it only made sense that they would gather so many precious ores. Even if there was nothing else, Lionel felt that he could create so much with just what was before him. He saw several mountainous piles of herb ore, countless types of vein and elemental ores. He even saw some true 4th-dimensional ores hidden within that might have slipped through the cracks. Yet, there was still one more floor. As shocked as Lionel was on the second, the third floored him. He finally bowed down. He was indeed a poor man. He apologized for ever believing that he was wealthy. No matter where he looked, there were endless mountainous piles of 4th-dimensional ores. If the gold piles could have buried a normal human, these could bury even Lancelot and King Arthur. Seeing such a sight, Lionel thought that King Arthur was too stingy for even hesitating to say yes to him. Even if he wanted to take and use it all, would he even be able to? But, at the same time, Lionel was shocked. Just how did a pseudo-4th-dimensional world like this produce so many 4th-dimensional metals? There even seemed to be more of them than there was on the second level. How did that even make any sense? It was safe to say that any guilt Lionel would have felt taking advantage of Camelot like this flew out the window. Chapter 455. How did you gather so much? Lionel finally asked Leonis. These? Leonis started. This room didn't used to be so full. It got like this after the Merlin trials collapsed. Lionel's eyes widened. You mean? These used to be rewards you could spend skill points to buy. But, after the trials collapsed, they were all collected up by us. Lionel was speechless. Back then, he had been mostly worried about gathering up the core of the trial world. Since he was taking it, he felt it would be too shameless to take anything else, so he only accepted the goddess necklace after Krakos brought it to him personally. But he hadn't expected that he had really missed out on so much. Now that Lionel thought about it, when he was within the trials, he had been overwhelmed by the sheer volume of items within the special store. So, instead of scrolling through all of them one by one, he used his voice to filter for what he wanted to look for. In that situation, he didn't really have time to leisurely scroll through the store, so he always filtered using his voice. Due to this, he didn't have a proper understanding of the scope of items that could be found within the special store. I was too nice, Lionel thought to himself. Lionel shook his head. Most of the ores he saw here were tier 1 to 3 black-grade ores. This put them at the lower levels of the fourth dimension. But the sheer volume might very well be beyond anything even the Empire had managed to gather to this point. Of course, Lionel couldn't confirm this with any sort of certainty, but he felt that he likely wasn't too far off with his assessment. My divine armor. If I can, Lionel slowly shook his head. He didn't feel he was skilled enough to complete his divine armor just yet, not to mention the fact he hadn't even decided just what kind of divine armor to build. Still, if there was ever a place to train, this would be it. And there was likely no better place for Lionel to find the resources he needed to build it. Wait. Lionel's gaze swept through the massive treasure house. At that moment, he suddenly shot forward, stunning Leonis who had been by his side. Wait for me. Leonis ran after Lionel. Leonis had unfortunately yet to reach the peak of the third dimension, so he hadn't broken through like his father, mother, sister, and the others. So, he was obviously no match for Lionel in speed. Luckily, this storehouse was only a few hundred meters in length and width. Even though Lionel was much faster, he couldn't go very far to begin with. Leonis found Lionel amidst a pile of ores, his hand pressed flush against its side. Ah. Be careful, if it falls over. Lionel nodded, acknowledging Leonis' worries. If he died beneath a pile of precious ores he had just been greedily eyeing, wouldn't that be too pathetic? The pile suddenly shifted, causing Leonis' heart to seize. But Lionel didn't panic. Soon, as though by magic, the pile separated, revealing a radiant piece of Oregon. Lionel grabbed onto the ore as the rest of the pile settled down. Only then did Leonis feel his heart calm down once again. He had forgotten that Lionel was a variant earth mage. Something like this was within his abilities. But the level of control that was needed was beyond Leonis' imagining. Leonis shook his head and looked curiously at the shimmering black ore in Lionel's hands. You recognize this ore? Leonis asked, somewhat curious. Though they had brought all of these ores here, the truth was that they had yet to research most of their functions. In this aspect, they were still very much in the dark compared to others. Usually, the Merlin trials would have a short explanation of what the ore was before they chose it. But, obviously, with it collapsed, it couldn't provide such functionality. This? I recognize all the ores. Lionel said with a smile. This one is black herb ore. It's a foundational type metal used as a fusion agent in crafts. It works almost like iron in that it has a base type that can be forged into all sorts of chemical structures depending on your approach and technique. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say it was the most important ore in the entire universe. This one is special though because it was on the verge of becoming bronze herb ore before it was mined from its core. So, the ore essence within it is a margin purer than regular black herb Oregon. This ore might be able to help me clear a final hurdle in my metal body. Leonis' brows raised in surprise. It wasn't because of Lionel's detailed explanation, but rather because Lionel said he recognized all of these ores. Even though Leonis wasn't educated on the topic, he could easily tell that there were hundreds of types of ores in this room, each with their own unique variations. To be able to recognize them all would take an absolute expert. Lionel took a deep breath. First, I need to organize this room. There's no order to anything. Lionel always liked things to be neat and tidy. This was why his room was always meticulously kept after, though he cared less about his own appearance. It was just a quirk of his. He had the compulsion to organize these ores by type and ability. It would make what he wanted to do next much more efficient. Things may get a bit wild, Leonis. Stay close to me if you'd like to remain here. Leonis nodded and then shook his head. It's fine. I have a feeling this will take a long time, no need for me to continuously be looking over your shoulder. Leonis chuckled. If you need anything else, just let me know. There will be another council gathering soon to strategize defensive measures. We also can't be certain of the Empire's plans now and if they've changed. Lionel nodded in acknowledgement. He didn't expect everyone to base plans around him to begin with. It may very well be possible that Arthur wasn't too optimistic about him from the beginning. In the end, he was just a single third-dimensional being. How much change could he really cause? At the moment, it was very likely that all the forts and the capital were being attacked. If Lionel wanted to swing his weight around, he would need more. Lionel could already sense that there was the evolution he had been looking for so long hidden in these piles. It was just unfortunately more difficult to reach. There was no doubt that this evolution was the most important centerpiece of his divine armor, and there was just enough of it to form the 3 portions of essence he needed. Lionel's gaze sharpened as he looked around. This would be his battlefield. Chapter 456. The instant Leonis had left the range, the treasure vault became a violent storm of swirling oars. Lionel sat at the very center of it all, in silent meditation. Oars swooped inches from his body at speeds that surpassed a bullet, yet he didn't flinch. How could he? They were all in his control to begin with. If others were watching on, they would find that the disorganized store of oars was very quickly tending toward disorganized order. Then from there, it very quickly became completely tidy. Beads of sweat fell down Lionel's brow. Without a choice, he activated his bronze runes. This instantaneously made the control of the metals around him several times easier, even to the point that the speed they whizzed around the room with even accelerated. It should have been impossible for Lionel to control so many oars at once. At the very least, he shouldn't have been able to guarantee that they didn't crash into each other. After all, Lionel could split his mind more than a dozen ways, but it definitely wasn't to the point of being able to do so hundreds of ways. Rather, Lionel used a much cleverer method. He drew a map of the treasure stores in his dream world, rebuilding a 3-dimensional construct. Then, he color-coded pathways for the oars to follow, ensuring that these pathways rarely, if ever, crossed. Almost as though he was playing a game, Lionel sorted these oars one after another. This way, all he had to do was focus on ensuring that the oars always stuck to these pathways, and it was not necessary for him to split his mind more than a dozen or so ways, each for a different kind of organ. Very quickly, Lionel spread out the oars, arranging them into neat rows with clean roads between them. The first division was in ore types. There was a section for foundational ores, veins ores, vessel ores, domain ores, and finally, the pile Lionel was most looking forward to, evolution ores. Foundational ores were over 70% made of herb ores. Other foundational ores simply weren't as common or as useful. They had very specific use cases that made them almost useless. And, oftentimes, their functions could be accomplished by herb or to an even better degree. So, other foundational ores were only used in rare instances. The only foundational ore that made Lionel take a pause while observing it was lava rhombus Oregon. It had only one functional use case, the fusion of earth and fire type ores. When hearing this, one can understand why such foundational ores were looked down upon. For one, earth and fire weren't opposing elements, herb ore could allow their fusion easily, there was simply no need for this special use case. However, Lionel, for obvious reasons, was intrigued. While herb ore could be used in every use case, it also required a high level of skill. Knowing exactly how to temper the ore to receive the desired effect was the bane of many force crafters. These unique foundation ores, however, could be used in complex constructs to make them far simpler. After separating out these 5 major categories, the rest was obviously down to the elements and other unique cases like soul-type ores. Once Lionel was finished, he looked back toward the smallest pile. Of course, this held the evolution ores. there were actually enough for 13 portions of essence. If Lionel combined this with the 7 he already had, this meant that he could form 2 complete portions of bronze evolution ore. One had to remember that 10 black evolution ores could form a bronze evolution ore and that 100 bronze evolution ores could form a silver one. Evolution ores had 2 abilities. The first was fusing 2 ores into a unique or never before seen. And its second ability was to evolve an ore to the next level. A black evolution ore could evolve a 3rd dimensional ore into the 4th, while a bronze evolution ore could evolve a 4th dimensional ore into the 5th. According to the speculations of Lionel's father, if one formed their divine armor's core with 10 black evolution ores, it was theoretically possible to form a quasi-5th dimensional divine armor while still being within the 4th dimension. Lionel thought back to the quasi-bronze grade ore he had found within the hive, Warping Domain, Oregon. If he made it the core of his divine armor, wouldn't he be able to cross that barrier and stand firmly within the 5th dimension? Even if he couldn't, the effects would be so infinitely close to the 5th dimension that nothing within the 4th dimension would be able to withstand its impact. Of course, this wouldn't be in terms of strength but rather in terms of function. Though Lionel hadn't settled on the design of his divine armor, the one thing he knew for certain was that his warping domain ore would be the centerpiece of it all. Warping ore was able to create an independent space that could make even a single step feel like an entire mile. Due to this, it was quite well known for its defensive abilities, but as Lionel learned more about domains, he felt that they were far more flexible than this. The uses of domain were as variable as the uses of an ability, it depended on a person's creativity to use it properly. Now that Lionel had this entire warehouse of ores available to him, the picture of his divine armor came into view. Rather than focusing on attack, defense, or elemental types, his plan would be very simple. He would maximize his own speed while ensuring his enemies felt as though taking even a single step was almost impossible. As Lionel looked through the various ores, he felt a picture becoming clearer and clearer in his mind. And the center of it all would be his warping domain, Oregon. However, whether he would be able to accomplish the aspirations forming in his mind would depend on if he could build up the skill he needed. While he had many types of ores around him, there was just a single warping domain. Oregon spatial type treasures were too rare, even to the point there were less than a dozen in this entire treasure store, and only 2 of which could match up to warping domain or in value. In that case, let's give this tiger wings. Lionel's gaze blazed. Maybe even Terrain could have never been aware that their greatest enemy would come in the form of a young man sitting cross-legged on the floor of a vast treasure vault. Chapter 457. Eat slowly, little Tolly, slowly now. Lionel wiped off sweat that threatened to sting his eyes once more. He never forgot that one of the hazards he learned about metal spirits was their propensity to overeat. If he let it happen, Tolliver could go mad and harm him. This was the main reason Tolliver had yet to evolve into the 4th dimension along with Blackstar. Lionel was very careful about how much he fed him and what he fed him. Lionel preferred to give the little fella high-quality ores that would fill him very quickly. This was much better than feeding Tolliver a lot of low-quality ores. The more high-quality ores Tolliver ate, the more powerful the little guy would become in relation to its evolution stage. So, Lionel took this very seriously. Oh, Tolliver suddenly shot out of Lionel's gloved hands. The little guy's body concentrated into a single point before explosively growing. Lionel realized that this was a sign that little Tolly was finally crossing into the 4th dimensional realms. Lionel's mind had already entered such a realm, so he was very confident that he would still be able to control and command Tolliver appropriately. Tolliver came back to Lionel looking just that much more lustrous. Ready to work, little guy? Bloop, bloop. Lionel smiled lightly before his expression suddenly changed. He quickly commanded little Tolliver to float in the air as he scanned his black gloves. After just a moment, he smiled bitterly, watching it corrode as though having been dipped in strong acid. Lionel sighed, peeling the gloves off of his hands before it got worse. He didn't have replacement gloves. And, though he felt he might be able to make them, how would he? He needed gloves to craft with little Tolliver but couldn't make the gloves he needed to craft with Tolliver, without little Tolliver. Lionel grit his teeth. I have been avoiding this training for a long time. No time better than the present. One of the last lessons of his father's beginner's guide was to begin to stray away from gloves. The stronger a metal spirit became, the more elaborate a force crafter's gloves became. Eventually, they would become a hindrance to hand speed and coordination. Honestly, Lionel thought his dad was a madman. As if calling himself Father Overlord wasn't bad enough, the old man actually wanted to kill him. Lionel took a deep breath and activated his bronze runes once again, thinking back to the words his father had spoken. You are a Morales, the earth bows down to you, not the other way around. Gloves are for cowards. It made Lionel wonder why his father put a hazard section in the dictionary at all. First it was forming a fifth-dimensional divine armor, and now it was force crafting without protection. Lionel couldn't help but feel that his old man was simply too irresponsible. Lionel brought out the first catapult, steadying his beating heart. With a flip of his palm, a familiar chain necklace appeared in Lionel's hand. Fine cracks spread across its surface, causing a flicker of rage to appear in Lionel's heart. This chain necklace was the very first quasi-bronze treasure Lionel ever possessed. Unfortunately, due to Miles almost blowing him to smithereens, it was heavily damaged. The truth of the matter was that it should have been impossible for explosives of the 21st century like Miles used back then to damage a near fifth-dimensional treasure. The main issue is that this was an energy-based treasure. As a result, it had to rely on the force around it in order to form its defensive shields. This was exactly why it stopped working when Lionel was under the influence of the force disruption towers. Simply put, this chain necklace was using third-dimensional force to protect itself and as a result was far weaker than it should have been. If it was using fourth-dimensional force, it would likely take at least 24th century explosives and technology to damage it to this extent. That was right. At full strength, this chain necklace could survive several blows from the crossbows that White Knight Daoist couldn't survive 2 strikes of. This was the power of quasi-bronze treasures, this was their true value. It was just a shame that this chain necklace was damaged. For now, that is. This was Lionel's first test for himself. If he wanted to gain enough skill to build his divine armor, he would need to build up his skill just as quickly as he built up his strength within Brave City. The only way he could protect himself, his friends and Aina would be if he had the strength to do so, and this was his fastest path toward that end. Lionel smiled lightly. If I have my divine armor, I won't need this. In that case, I'll combine both necklaces into one. This should be a good birthday present. Lionel took out the treading goddess necklace. His mind spun with thoughts. He wanted to combine 3 abilities into one. First, the defensive abilities of the chain necklace, the teleportation abilities of the treading goddess necklace, and finally, add something on the end to give Aina a sensory boost. After half an hour of meditation, his gaze grew cold and calculating. He outstretched a hand and allowed little Tali to land in his bare palm. Lionel hadn't been wrong. Earth was in shambles, facing battles on all fronts. All 8 forts and even the capital was under siege. The only difference was that the capital was under siege by 2 cities with the moon, Camelot, and the 8 forts only being under siege by 1 each. However, surprisingly, at this moment, the Emperor of Earth sat in his garden, the delicate chirping of birds around him. He continued to meditate, raising a cup of tea to his mouth without opening his eyes. He listened intently to a report, not showing any particular reaction. That should be all, Imperial Grandfather. This is the current situation of the Camelot satellite. Emperor Fox nodded his head. You may go. Noah hesitated. Was that all his grandfather wanted to tell him? Where were the orders? Should he continue to try and assimilate Camelot and the Demon Empire? Or should he focus on wiping out White City? Grandfather, Is there something else? Emperor Fox let out a deep sigh, his eyes opening to reveal 2 piercing emerald gems. It felt as though he had the whole world within his purview. Noah, you've grown too reliant on me. Noah didn't know what to say. He stared at the talisman in his hand at a complete loss. Did you know that your cousin is on that satellite right now? Noah's expression changed. The very same white knights you came to report to me about, he's already killed one. He didn't have an army, he didn't have support, he only had himself. Noah's heart seized. How was that possible? That, do not contact me again until White City is nothing but flat earth. Chapter 458. Noah placed the talisman down, a small hint of shock on his face. Still, it only took him a moment for him to regain his calm. Noah didn't know what his grandfather's ability was. In fact, he was certain that no one knew. Emperor Fox was a man who always kept his cards close to his chest. Even his closest advisors might not know everything he was thinking about. But, this was the way of an emperor. To remain so calm even in the face of everything you and your ancestors had built potentially burning down, this was the marker of a true ruler. That said, Noah wasn't so certain that this was all about calmness. He always got the sense that his grandfather wasn't calm but rather, confident. It was a subtle difference that was hard to grasp but even harder to fake. However, as the prince of the empire, Noah knew the situation well. And, quite frankly, there was simply nothing to be confident about. Earth was caught completely unprepared. This wasn't a failure of Emperor Fox and the royal family, but rather simply due to circumstances. Who could have predicted the appearance of Camelot? And who could have predicted that a second acceleration would occur right after the first? In truth, Camelot should have been a variable terrain couldn't prepare for. But, due to the circumstances, it became a saving grace for them instead. What would you like to do? Jessica interrupted Noah's thoughts. Maybe only she was allowed to listen in on a conversation between the emperor and a prince. Noah tapped on the large table before him, his thoughts running wild. He wasn't very sure how he felt about his cousin. He didn't hate nor love Lionel, he was about as neutral on the topic as one could get. At the same time, he could also tell that his grandfather wasn't overly eager to bring Lionel back to the palace either. Though it was said like this wasn't to say that Emperor Fox didn't want anything to do with Lionel. If that was the case, he wouldn't praise him so much. Rather, the main point was that the emperor was content to watch Lionel spread his wings out from afar. According to the information we have, there's a great possibility that he is within Camelot at the moment. The dead white knight that His Imperial Majesty mentioned should have fallen before the attack on the First Barony. That attack occurred within 20 to 30 kilometers of Camelot. This coupled with the fact reports say that Prince Lionel was a part of the zone trial that brought Camelot here, and this is the most appropriate conclusion. Noah nodded non-committedly. How do you think he managed it? Noah couldn't help but ask after a while. Jessica didn't respond. She had been with Noah long enough to know that whenever he asked questions he knew they didn't have enough information to answer, that he didn't really expect one. Noah was usually a meticulous, hard-nosed, and between-the-lines kind of person. The only moments he acted like this was after he finished speaking with his grandfather. He didn't even seem to have the same aura about him anymore. Noah stood, his calm returning in full. It seems that Imperial Grandfather was correct. There are many eyeing our Earth, and some of them might even still be lurking in the shadows even now. Maybe it's time we show them that we aren't pushovers. Noah walked to the side of his military tent. Located on what would have been a wall, there was a weapons rack, but it was filled with nothing but sabers. However, shockingly enough, each and every one of these sabers were as large as a human body, carrying blades that seemed capable of cleaving a mountain in two. Despite their heft, Noah picked up the first with a single arm. Its radiant blue blade reflected beneath the dim flickering lights. It seemed to exude a magic aura. This one will do. With a flip of his palm, the saber vanished and Noah walked to the entrance of his tent. Jessica, all the preparations you made for the Demon Empire, forget them for now. We have a city to level. Jessica nodded. According to their intelligence, the Demon Empire had allied with Camelot and planned to submit to the Empire. With this sudden change, their thoughts might turn from submission to thoughts of taking advantage of the empire in their time of weakness to maintain their own sovereignty. In that case, rather than giving them a hollow show of power for mere negotiations, they'd show them a real one. Within Camelot's treasure vaults, Lionel had no idea that his grandfather was aware of his presence already. In fact, he wasn't even aware that he had a grandfather to begin with. In Lionel's mind, his only family was his father and his missing mother. But, maybe even if he was aware, he wouldn't have the mind to think about it. Lionel sat on the ground, beads of sweat falling down his face. If one stopped focusing on his visage and focused on his hands, it would be possible to see a ghastly sight without compare. Blood dripped from Lionel's hands, ricocheting off the ground and echoing through the vast vault. Little Tolly happily swam around Lionel's fingers, not realizing the damage it was causing. But, Lionel couldn't blame the little guy. Despite having evolved into the fourth dimension, it was still nothing but a toddler. In fact, the little guy hadn't even really begun to form cohesive thoughts of its own. Though Lionel could command Blackstar with words, little Tolly didn't accept such direction well. Lionel had to use a series of images for Tolliver to understand his meaning. However, understanding didn't make it any less painful. There was good news and bad news. The bad news was that it was almost impossible to suffer such pain and focus on crafting at the same time. How could one maintain a steady connection and complete such intricate actions when it felt like the world was collapsing around them? The good news, however, was that Lionel managed to evolve under pressure and create a new ability. He called the ability Dream Sense. Since it was so hard to feel such pain and focus at the same time, why do so at all? Dream Sense allowed Lionel to split his senses the exact same way he split his mind. It was just an extension of his Dream Clone ability. Lionel used Dream Sense to split his mind two ways. One tackled the brunt of the pain he was feeling while the second focused entirely on his crafting. It was on the third day of using this ability that Lionel evolved once more. He realized something incredibly important. If he could split his senses to help him focus, why not split his sensory pain between several minds? If he did that, wouldn't this allow him to dull his pain by several factors? If he split the same pain between 10 minds, wouldn't he reduce his own pain by a factor of 10? This realization truly opened Lionel up to a new world. If he could control his mind even down to this minute level, just what other possible abilities could his creativity have in store for him? Chapter 459. After grasping an initial mastery of Dream Sense, Lionel realized just how much freedom he had in this regard. While he could diverge his senses by separating his mind, if he instead chose to layer and concentrate his senses instead, he could cause a convergent response instead. In the end, this meant that Lionel was suddenly capable of both dulling and magnifying his senses by several times, all of which was limited by the number of dream clones he could form. On the surface, this wasn't very important, but the applications Lionel could think of were practically endless. For one, if Lionel had the ability to dull his pain in this fashion, he wouldn't have struggled nearly as much to open the 9th door of his metal synergy lineage factor. By extension, if Lionel applied his higher pain threshold to other training methods, he could force his body to withstand much more than it previously could. Though the idea of suffering through pain and tempering one's willpower sounded nice, this was something that could only appear in fantasy novels. The human body had strict limits on the pain it could withstand for a reason. Going beyond these limits often meant the shutting down of one's body regardless of how much willpower you had. Pushing past these limits was often impossible, not for lack of willpower, but simply due to lack of feasibility. At the same time, however, these thresholds were often lower than they could be. This made sense. If one's body only shut down when at the very edge of breaking down, it might no longer be possible to pull back. But, like this, Lionel would be able to use his own senses to look for his bodhi's breaking point and choose a safe point to stop before then. This ultimately gave Lionel far more control over his own body. Still, the applications of this were far beyond just dulling pain. If Lionel applied this skill to his internal sight, for example, he could make it several times more sensitive than it had been in the past. This could not only make his calculations more detailed and accurate, it would also be almost impossible for someone to slip by his senses. Applied in this way, Lionel could layer his vision to gain more details in a single look. He could layer his sense of touch to make his fingers more sensitive during force crafting. He could even layer his sense of taste to make food tastier if he so chose to. The potential applications were almost endless. When Lionel realized this, his mind seemed to implode. It wasn't with pain, but rather felt as though a door had been thrust open to him. Lionel sent all his focus into his arms, first separating his mind to control them independently, then layering them once again to multiply this same control. The instant he finished this, his finger speed hitched for a moment before it felt as though they broke past a barrier. His movements became smoother and more fluid, his control over little Tali reaching unprecedented heights. This is it. Superior Grade 1 designation. Lionel's hand coordination and speed had been stuck at Advanced Grade 1 designation for a long time. Thanks to his metal synergy lineage factor, he was effectively as good as someone who had already stepped into Superior Grade 1 designation, but it hadn't been a true breakthrough just yet, until just now. Looking down at his bloodied hands, orchestrating the movements of thin lines of silver like a conductor guiding a voluminous sonata, he couldn't help but laugh. This feeling, he had never expected it to feel so good. Lionel's confidence shot through the roof. He finally felt as though his body could keep up with his mind. It was almost as though his own body had become one of his familiars as well. He controlled it no differently than he took control of little Tali and little Blackstar. The two necklaces before Lionel seemed to magically and seamlessly fuse into two. In the blink of an eye, Lionel completed a task he had spent several days on. The treading goddess necklace became more resplendent, exuding a silvery aura. Without looking to the side, Lionel locked onto a soul type ore from the vein and vessel piles. Lionel had already long since picked these two ores out. If he wanted to give this necklace a sensory boost, this was the only way. The vessel ore was known as Ghost Whispering Oregon. It had the ability to continuously absorb and purify force into soul force. It was born in places with exceptionally dark energy, and due to this ability to create soul force, it became known as the Ghost Oregon. The vein ore was known as Soul Pulsing Oregon. When fed an appropriate amount of soul force, it had the ability to amplify it. But, what made it so useful was the fact it was able to resonate with whoever marked it, thus effectively become an extension of this person's own soul force. Due to this ore's sensitivity to souls and their resonance, it gave whoever fused with it an equally great sensitivity to the resonance of other souls in proportion to how much soul force it was provided with. When these two ores came together, the results were exponentially greater. By Lionel's previous estimates, it would have taken him at least a week to finish the integration of these two ores without disrupting the balance of the remainder of the treasure. After all, the more moving parts a treasure had, the more complex it was and the more difficult it was to succeed in crafting. Yet, Lionel now felt a confidence he never had before. He felt as though the entire world was in his hands. The communication between one's brain and their body was a limiting factor to everyone. This was why endless training was necessary to break down the body and force it to understand the tasks the brain wanted it to complete. But, for the current Lionel, at least within certain limitations, he could control his body to the finest detail on the very first try. All of his mental prowess was concentrated into his hands. As though each joint had become a node to be controlled at his whim, he took hold of his own body like it was a puppet on strings. Bend to my will. Chapter 460. Lionel's right hand moved like the wind, wrapping around the Ghost Whispering Oregon. At the same time, his left shot toward the soul pulsing ore, working with complete independence. Leon's gaze stared out into blank space. It was as though his mind was completely wiped. It even felt like his eyes might roll back into their sockets at any moment. Yet, the speed of his hands didn't slow in the slightest. Lionel's right hand rapidly tapped at the Ghost Whispering Oregon. Little Tali raced across its surface, causing it to spin rapidly and heat up even faster. Smoky impurities flew into the air and dripped down from the green Oregon. It shrunk at a speed visible to the naked eye, falling from the size of a palm to the width of just a few fingernails. Lionel's left didn't stop. It stretched out at odd angles, causing little Tolly to spread across the soul-pulsing ore's surface. Very quickly, the red soul-pulsing ore became an incredibly thin length of metal wrapped the entire way by little Tolly's body. Yet, it seemed as though the thinness wasn't enough for Lionel as he continued to elongate the metal. From an ore of barely 2 inches thick, the soul-pulsing ore became a thin line that stretched almost 5 meters. Finally satisfied, Lionel's left fingers twitched, causing the thin line to fold in on itself lengthwise, thus having it to just over 2 meters. To the naked eye, it seemed as though nothing had happened other than this. But, any sharp force crafters would be able to see that after folding it, Lionel used the added thickness he gained to roll the thin line into a thin tube. The ore ultimately became a fragile hollow tube that seemed capable of snapping in on its own weight at any moment. But, what happened next was truly magical. Little Tolly, who had wrapped itself around the thin tube at Lionel's command, suddenly began to move. At first it seemed as though the little guy was snapping the delicately constructed ore in half, but it soon became clear that this wasn't the case at all. Little Tolly began to bend and contort into an intricate shape. The more time passed, the more complex the structure became and the smaller size it seemed to shrink to. It felt almost as though Lionel was constructing a miniature maze, hidden within the thin, gorgeous lines of the soul-pulsing Oregon. But, the reality was that he was constructing something much more miraculous than that. In just an hour, the over 2-meter-long tube had been sculpted into a small spiderweb of structures with a width of no more than half an inch. From afar, it looked like an oval gem. But, up close one could see that it was a maze of delicately forged lines. As though by coincidence, the tempering of Lionel's ghost whispering ore concluded at the exact same time. By now, it looked like nothing more than a flowing blue liquid, having lost its green color during the purification process. Without a single pause, Lionel communicated with little Tolliver to bring the thin blue liquid forward. Then, as though he was a madman, he controlled it to pour over the delicate red structure he had just formed. One would think that with the heat difference, the red structure Lionel took so long to form was finished. The melting point of ghost whispering ore was simply far higher than that of soul pulsing ore. There shouldn't have been even a chance for it to survive. However, little Tolly's body had yet to stop covering the delicate red structure. In 2 parts, Lionel both controlled little Tolly to protect the delicate maze while on another hand controlling the blue liquid to pour over it. The blue substance wormed throughout the structure, sliding through impossibly small crevices with absolute ease. If other force crafters saw Lionel now, they would be stunned to the point of speechlessness. Such a process would usually be done in several steps. The easiest method would have been to split the structure into 2 molds before fusing them into one at the end. However, Lionel didn't take this approach at all despite it being the far easier option. The reason for this was quite intuitive. When using 2 molds, it would be impossible to avoid imperfections. The only way to guarantee a sublime result would be to complete the gem in a single step. But, those who had the skill to do such things were simply too few. One had to remember that most would never even reach the advanced grade 1 designation, let alone the superior grade 1 designation. In addition, those who could use metal spirits who were known for their ability to complete intricate crafts were even fewer. Lionel's vision regained his clarity and a sudden wave of fatigue slammed into him. His mind spun and he collapsed to the ground, the skin of his hands peeling and dripping with blood. Lionel sent a glance toward the newly reforged treading goddess necklace, a light smile creeping up on his lips. He modified it so that Aina could wear it as a headpiece again. It looked much less flashy than it did in the past and the only exotic thing about it was the purple gem that hung from its center. But, Lionel was greatly satisfied. He felt that his skill had reached a new level. Hey dictionary, scan this treasure for me. *ping**, treasure, unnamed, abilities, minor teleportation, instant teleportation within 3 meters once every 3 seconds. Has enough stores to save up for 2 charges, force skin, at full charge, capable of withstanding 3 strikes of a pseudo 5th-dimensional entity, sensory boost, increased sensitivity and range of internal sight by a factor of 3, grade, elite quasi-bronze, Lionel grinned. This should be a good birthday present, right? Other than the fact the teleportation charges had fallen from 3 to 2 from the original Treading God's necklace, everything else was perfect. Lionel still remembered those emotions that ran through him when Miles and Simeon almost killed the two of them. Back then, he had greatly regretted not giving Aina the defensive treasure he had chosen for her earlier. Her birthday is just a few weeks away, I'll give it to her then. Lionel thought with a smile. After thinking this, Lionel became serious once more. Originally, he had expected it to take him at least a month to complete Aina's present. By the time he finished, he believed he would have the skill he needed to build the crafts he had in mind. But he never expected for him to have a breakthrough and ultimately take less than a month. But this was even better. Now, he could begin immediately. Though his body was tired, Lionel's mind was still sharp. He felt an endless energy coming from his dream world. He felt as long as his mind was awake, the state of his body meant little. Grand heal. Lionel was showered with blinding light elemental force, the injuries to his hands repairing at impossible speeds. Let's start. Chapter 461. A knock sounded. Lionel? Aina? Ho-ho, feel free to ignore Big Sis if it's inconvenient to. Before Mordred could finish her words, the door to the room opened. Mordred's words were caught in her throat as she blinked speechlessly. Aina stood before her with an equally questioning glance. It had already been more than a week since they came here, but this was the first time someone had come to check on Aina. Well, aside from the usual delivery of food that came every so often. Camelot wasn't clear on Aina's strength, while King Arthur believed that Lionel wasn't quite strong enough to make a big difference either. Though King Arthur had battled and lost to Lionel before, those circumstances were quite special. Back then, due to his pride, he fell into Lionel's rhythm and tried to compete with him in speed casting. Objectively speaking, back then, if Lionel had to battle either Mordred or King Arthur, it would have been a difficult and long fight even after grasping the Winter Realm with his bow. This was how much strength these two legends had. Had King Arthur been more level-headed back then, Lionel wouldn't have been able to make such a fool out of him. This much should have been clear by the fact that, despite the optics of it all, Arthur came out of their battle completely unscathed. And now, King Arthur had finally crossed the barrier he had stalled at for so many years. This wasn't all either. Because now, the people of Camelot were considered to be people of Earth. As the world evolved, the people of Camelot, too, began to awaken to their own abilities. This was all to say that the King Arthur of now was by far and away stronger than the version of himself Lionel would have already struggled mightily to defeat. So, despite the fact that Lionel had grown since then as well, he was unlikely to last a few exchanges with the current King Arthur even now, so it made sense that no one had come to communicate with Aina and Lionel. In their minds, what difference could these two children possibly make? The only person who knew that it was inadvisable to underestimate Lionel was Mordred, and this was because she knew everything about him, even secrets he had never exposed to another before. But there was one interesting thing about that trial that Mordred hadn't told Lionel about. Back then, the first part of the trial was a test of sifting through information. It took some time for Lionel to realize that the main character of his trial was actually Mordred and not someone else. Mordred, of course, had to deal with this same issue. But, compared to Lionel, she had a much harder time deciphering the truth. This wasn't only because Lionel had an ability conducive to such analysis while she did not, but it was because it almost felt as though Lionel's life had not one, but two main characters to it. And the other character? It was exactly this young girl before her. When Mordred laid eyes on Aina, a welling of almost motherly sympathy burst out from her heart. You poor girl, you have to treat yourself better. Your scars have flared up again. Aina flinched when she heard these words and involuntarily took a step back. Unlike Lionel, who had been there, she wasn't aware why Mordred would somehow know so much about her. Saying that her scars had flared up would be a simple observation for anyone. But, to say again so familiarly, why did it feel like Mordred knew this wasn't the first time this had happened? Aina's scars had, indeed, been inflamed once again. In fact, they had a raging violet redness to them that was even more severe than when Lionel had seen them at their worst. After using the cleansing waters, they had calmed and appeared like normal scars. Though they were still ever present, they looked like normal knife wounds. But now, they looked like they had been infested by a nasty infection once again. Having seen almost as much of Aina's life as she had seen of Lionel's, Mordred knew well that Aina's scars only flared up like this when she used them to facilitate her training. Mordred sighed seeing Aina's reaction. She too felt that she was a bit too rash with her words. Aina had no idea that she had seen most of her life as well. "May I come in?" Mordred asked. By now, Mordred was certain that Lionel wasn't present. "Damned boy, how can you be so bad with women? She's clearly in a distressed state yet you've gone off and disappeared." As much as Mordred knew about Aina's life, she knew even more about Lionel's. She knew how easily he detached himself. Whether it came to his mother or James, she didn't think that anything would change when it came to Aina either. Unfortunately, Lionel might have high emotional intelligence, but even he couldn't be perfect. He still had some things to learn, it seemed. Aina nodded. Mordred sighed. Come. Let's get you an ice pack, I'm sure that this can't feel very good." Aina wasn't sure why she allowed Mordred to enter, truthfully. Despite Mordred's talks of an ice pack, Aina never mentioned the fact Lionel's cleansing waters could likely heal her back to her previous state. I want to fight," Aina suddenly said. "Fight?" Mordred was stunned. "Yes, I want to join the battlefield. But, I wasn't sure who to talk to, so I've been waiting here." Mordred hesitated. She was hoping to help Aina out a bit, maybe spend some time with the young girl. After all, if there was anyone who understood what it felt like to be alone, it was Mordred. But, something about it made her realize that it was almost too difficult to say no to this girl. It looked as though if she said no, Aina would go off on her own to find her own battles. Thinking back to the scenes Mordred had seen of Aina's life, Mordred could only grit her teeth and agree. The last time that monster came out of her, she and Lionel were in that French zone. I need to be there if it happens again. Chapter 462. Though it might seem isolated, news of the war between Earth and Terrain spread like a wildfire throughout the universe. It could be said that a world wasn't truly considered to be a part of the dimensional verse until it entered the fourth dimension. But, Earth in specific was wildly eyed by powerful entities due to its potential. It was exactly because of this that war between two mere fourth-dimensional worlds had suddenly become such a hot topic. The truth was that though Earth was favored, it was the world itself that was, not its people. Who cared which citizens populated it as long as the world existed? In fact, many other fourth-dimensional worlds were quite jealous of Terrain. The truth was that Terrain was the only fourth-dimensional world close enough to execute such a war plan. It wasn't by coincidence that Lionel and Aina could reach with a single talisman. These words peeled back the requirements for such an invasion to succeed. Firstly, two worlds had to exist on the same plane. It would be almost impossible for a fifth-dimensional world or above to accomplish such a thing. Or, more accurately, the price they would need to pay to do this wouldn't be worth it. This was also why Terrain needed to wait until Earth evolved. The second requirement was closeness. The universe was too vast, it would be impossible for another fourth-dimensional world from a wildly different quadrant to even dream of attacking Earth. Terrain happened to meet both of these requirements and now its actions were a hotly discussed topic. But, while most of the universe was just observing curiously, there was a group of people that was infuriated, the powers of Terrain. If there was one group of people that was completely caught off guard by this, even more than the people of Earth, it was these powers. In one moment, they were negotiating terms to sell themselves to a higher power, and in the next moment, half the value of their world was plundered and taken. Who's going to explain to me how this happened? A thunderous roar shook Cliff's Edge Terrace. Stop all your yelling, is that going to get us anywhere? What did you say to me? Don't forget this is my territory, woman. Call me woman one more time and I'll peel your tongue out from your lips. Care to try me? Alright, alright. This isn't getting us anywhere. You're only wasting more time. TSK, we should have known they were planning something like this. It was obvious that they were planning something, but attacking Earth takes some balls. I didn't think that they'd have the guts to do it. 3 individuals gathered. The male with a booming voice was the head of Cliff's Edge Terrace, head Solar. The woman was the head of Mirage Pavilion, head Mirage. And, the mediator of the two was the head of World's End Falls, head Falls. That's exactly what doesn't make any sense. Who gave them the guts? Do they have any idea how many hidden allies Earth has? Do they have any idea how many other powers are eyeing Earth? Do they have a death wish? It seems like you're still the same idiot. Head Mirage sneered, her cherry lips parting in disdain. What did you say to me? Just think for a minute, blockhead. You think those people care about the people of Earth? Do you think there's such kindness in this world? The talents of Earth only come from those born on Earth. And, even then, it isn't as though one can just go to a powerful world to birth a child and manifest a talent, or else everyone would do it. Obviously, the people of Earth are worth more than the people of our world even if we started popping out babies over there right this second. You idiot, do you think you're the only one that knows that? Since you're still not getting it, I'll try to speak extra slowly. Head Falls rubbed his temples and shook his head. But in the end, he couldn't be bothered to stop their bickering again. A first-generation child is a baby which doesn't have a single parent from the world. They will gain at most a 20% blessing from the world and won't be gifted with all of its potential. The remaining 80% will come from where the baby's parents originated. If the baby has at least one first-generation parent, they will receive 50% of the world's blessing and will be considered a second-generation child. This will be the same even if both parents are first-generation, the percentages will not change. If the baby has at least one second-generation parent, they will receive 80% of the world's blessing. Once again, this will be the same even if both parents are second generation. If the baby has at least one third generation parent, they will receive 90%. At fourth generation, it will be 95%. And, with a parent at the fifth generation, the baby will finally be considered a full-blown native. It's at fourth generation where things change. At that stage, if both parents are fourth generation, then their baby will receive 100% of the world's blessing and also be considered a full native. Do you understand now? By this point, Head Solar wanted to explode. Did he look like a child? How could he not know these things? In fact, one of the most important things for a world to grasp after entering the fourth dimension and truly becoming a part of the dimensional verse was how to differentiate between immigrants and natives. There was no small number of people who wanted to take advantage of more talented worlds. In fact, even Terrain had to deal with this, let alone Earth. Do you really think I don't understand any of this? Clearly you don't. Head Mirage snapped. Our world is the only one in position to launch attacks from Earth for the foreseeable future. By the time any other worlds can come in and taste a piece of the pie, do you really think 5 generations wouldn't have passed by then? That's not even to mention the fact that there are plenty of 5th generation people on Earth right now. What's stopping them from being used like studs and sows? Head Solar froze. It seemed that this situation was far different from what he had imagined. Chapter 463. Head Solar calmed his rage and took a deep breath. So they're just taking a risk for a chance at survival? 5th dimensional worlds are much more common than 4th dimensional worlds. The number that would be in position to attack them is far more. Who's to say that with Earth's talent they'd even be able to establish themselves before they suffered the same fate? Though it was somewhat counterintuitive, after some thought it made more sense. It was best to consider the universe like a bell curve. It wasn't necessarily so that weaker worlds were more common. With the age of the dimensional verse, many worlds had had time to reach their potential. Due to the structure of things, the average talent of worlds was the fifth dimension. As such, the vast majority of worlds in the dimensional verse were within the fifth dimension. Likewise, the number of worlds within the fifth dimension that could attack Earth were likewise much more. If the cities won this war, how long would they get to enjoy it? A few decades at most? With Earth's potential, they likely wouldn't even need a century to cross yet another dimensional barrier. In fact, their situation is even worse than that. Head Solar sneered, suddenly thinking of something. Even if they really used Earth's people like sows and studs, it would take years for those children to mature. In the meantime, would they have the talent necessary to ensure that Earth wasn't swallowed by spacetime? Talent was a double-edged sword. Though better talents would be born in such a world, their zones were likewise more difficult and appeared more frequently as well. If those cities failed to clear the zones, Earth could very well be swallowed up. Head Falls sighed. Your words aren't wrong, but only partially. I'm sure you remember what happened in Brave City this time, right? Head Solar froze again. The heir of the Carefree family was accepted as a disciple of Valiant Heart Mountain. It's with this added layer of protection that they dare to do this. Head Solar frowned. But doesn't Earth have that Lionel child? He heard from his son that there was a Lionel character who was accepted without even having to go through the trials. Wasn't Lionel standing even higher than Anared's? How could this even count as protection? Yes, I've heard this as well. But, this protection is only useful if two conditions are met. The first is that they have to be worlds that Valiant Heart Mountain can directly act against. Secondly, they have to have officially joined and have to have high standing. Not only has this Lionel child not officially joined, but Earth's attackers are members of the fourth dimension. This is not something Valiant Heart Mountain can interfere in. Head Solar sighed, slumping into his chair. Higher dimensional worlds couldn't interfere even if they wanted to. Not only would the price be high, but there were unspoken rules to think of. Wars between lower-level worlds were usually observed with one eye closed and another open by these behemoths. Only when the threats were of the fifth dimension would Valiant Heart Mountain begin to have some deterrence. They're banking on the Carefree family heir joining in a few years and climbing up the disciple ranks. If only it were so simple. Head Falls sighed once again. I have reason to believe that the Carefree family heir's success has little to do with what benefits Valiant Heart Mountain can provide and much more about what his fiancée's family can. At this point, even Head Mirage, who had long since grasped everything, sat up. What do you know? She asked straightforwardly. It's only my speculation, just speak, stop beating about the bush. Head Solar pressed. They both knew about Head Falls' ability. If there were any deductions he could make, they would likely be very close to the truth. In reality, it was mostly because of this that they were caught off guard by things. They were so used to Head Falls seeing through everything in advance that they never even suspected what might happen. Now, they had been caught with their pants down. Head Falls took a deep breath. The appearance of young Miss Era is too mysterious. No one knows where she comes from, what strength she possesses, or what her goals are. All we know is that she is the fiancée to the Carefree family heir, nothing more, nothing less. I contacted Shield Cross Stars to hopefully find out some information about her, but my contacts weren't able to get anything back to me. The expression of the two heads changed. This realization didn't mean that Era's standing was above Shield Cross Stars. This was almost impossible. After all, Shield Cross Stars was considered to be the police of the universe. There were few if any powers that could ignore their influence. What this truly meant was that Head Falls' contacts weren't able to get him the information he needed. Simply put, their clearance wasn't high enough. This meant at least one thing for sure: Era wasn't from a world weaker than the fifth dimension. However, they did let slip one thing. According to them, a notice for fugitives was put out. Suspicious entities in all fourth-dimensional worlds within this star alignment were all marked with monitoring brands. But, most importantly, this order was requested by young Miss Era herself. As for what this means in totality, I'm not sure. But It for certain means that this young lady has the influence or, at the very least, the net worth necessary to accomplish such a thing. Head Solar's brows furrowed. What are you trying to get at? I feel you mean something more by telling us how potentially powerful she is, correct? Yes. Don't you think it's odd that, not to mention the fact the two haven't gotten married, but they haven't even set a date for their wedding yet? Almost like the Carefree family heir still hasn't proved himself yet? So, what kind of status would he gain once he did gain such acknowledgement? What if this acknowledgement is more important than any backing Valiant Heart Mountain could ever provide? The two heads sucked in a cold breath before a deathly silence fell over the room. Then, what should we do? Head Mirage was the one to finally break the silence. Head Falls didn't answer for a long while. For a moment, the two thought that he might never respond at all. But, when he finally did speak, they felt a swirl of complex emotions were surging within them. As things stand now, Earth still has a chance to defend itself. Though they're feeling the pressure, it isn't to the point their loss is guaranteed. As the saying goes, delivering coal in the winter is better than delivering water to an already smothered flame. What chance would Earth stand if instead of half our world's strength, it faced the entire brunt? Head Falls left the meeting of powers with a smirk on his face, a sharp glint lighting his eye. Chapter 464. Royal Blue Fort. The atmosphere was heated. The amount of pressure placed on the fort itself wasn't as great as one would have expected. At the very least, the colonists of Earth's 2 moons and the citizens of the capital were under far greater stress. The reason for this was obvious, but also placed the members of the fort in a terrible situation all the same. Unlike the capital, which had been revitalized and truly looked like a province once again, Royal Blue Province was still mostly in shambles. The only location of proper society was the fort. So why would the people of Terrain bother to attack right away? For different situations, different tactics were required. Camelot was a small terrain and mostly inhabited. As such, White City launched a full assault from the very beginning. Author's note: from now on, whenever Camelot is mentioned, assume it's in reference to Earth's 2nd moon unless the context says otherwise. However, Royal Blue Province was now mostly untouched territory. Other than the fort itself, the rest was just collapsed buildings, invalids, beasts, and the occasional outcast gang that overestimated themselves. Lionel had met such an outcast gang in the moments before he entered the Joan Zone. But, he had dealt with them quite easily in his rage due to their grotesque remarks about Aina. These outcasts were fools who thought they would be able to avoid the hand of the Empire when things finally settled down, when in reality they would likely be among the first killed when things truly reached that point. But now, to the people of Terrain, these outcasts had become a hot commodity. Since Earth was such a new world, most of its original citizens, by default, were within the 5th generation and beyond. This made every Earthener the people of Terrain ran across a hotly contested item. Yes, item. Not person. This situation left the people of Earth in an odd limbo. The capital was under a full-blown assault and unable to lend out help, while the rest of Earth's land was being rapidly colonized. The only way to stop this would be to send out armies from the forts to slow them down. But, how could these nobles that had just turtled themselves up dare to make a move so easily? They continued to cower within their walls, waiting for someone else to take action. After all, with the death of Miles, they could just pretend that they didn't have proper direction. Then, everything would fall on the shoulders of the Governor-Duke or the Secretary Marquisette. They wouldn't have to take any responsibility whatsoever. This was the harsh reality that peace could bring about. The sharpness the empire that once swept through Earth had dulled considerably. While there were no pushovers amongst nobles, it was also because of this that none of them wanted to rashly make a move. What if their sacrifice benefited another? How could they guarantee that their credit would be their own and not that of someone else's? This situation led to the fort closing its dome once again. As for the commoners on the outside, did they need to care for them? But it was in exactly this situation that the large oak doors to the gathering of nobles opened. A deathly silence fell. The number of people who dared to do such a thing were simply too few. And, since it was unlikely to be a person of the capital, it was pretty clear to them all who this person was. As expected, the clicking of heels reverberated through the quiet congressional hall. A beauty strolled in, her hips swinging like a hypnotic pendulum. It didn't seem like she had done it on purpose, but rather that innate charm exuded from her very pores. Despite the fact they all knew she had been an old hag just a year prior, the men within the room couldn't help but feel their loins light on fire. Who else could this person be if not Secretary Marquisette Maya? After another long disappearance, she had finally come back once again. As though nothing had changed, she easily sat at the helm of the hall, not feeling as though there was anything wrong in the slightest. One of the nobles frowned. Secretary Marquisette, this isn't appropriate. As a chief earl, the chief law officer of Royal Blue Province, there were few who knew the law better than Chief Earl Fiel. The position of one's seating was highly important to setting precedential hierarchy. But Maya now sat in a position reserved for the Governor-Duke. Even Miles hadn't been allowed to do this. In fact, Miles couldn't sit at any one of the leadership positions. Maya didn't respond directly. She only dug into her bosom and pulled out a noble crest. With a single look, any one of them could recognize it. Those rushing waters, the strong shield that blocked them from the lush grounds to its back. There was no doubt, this was the Luem family's crest. Chief Earl Fiel sat back down silently. There was already nothing more to say. In my absence, it seems that you all have had quite a bit of fun to yourselves, Maya said lightly. The nobles remained silent. They couldn't understand how this woman who so rarely appeared still wielded so much power. Just how did she do it? It seems that you all have forgotten what it means to be the nobles of the Ascension Empire. You all have felt too comfortable for too long. His Majesty, Emperor Fox, has ordered a code black martial law state, effective immediately. At that moment, the nobles who had managed to maintain their cool shot out from their seats, shock coloring their features. A code black state? Wasn't that too rash? Such a state could only be called upon when the empire was in danger of falling, but they were still very far from this future. What the hell was going on? Of course, this was only a very small part of why they were all so shocked. Code Black martial law had the fewest laws and restrictions of any state. But it had one very important clause that shook the nobles to their core. In such a state, everything was earned by merits. When it concluded and everything returned to normal, even their very own noble positions would be up for grabs and exchangeable for merits. Even the title of Grand Prime Minister or even Prince could be exchanged for. As for those who didn't have enough merits, they would lose the noble seats they spent so much of their time protecting. Chapter 465. From now on I will be in charge. Secretary Marquisette Maya's demeanor completely shifted. From a coquettish, seductive air, the atmosphere around her became oppressive and heavy. It felt as though she had become a completely different person. No. It was like she had gone back to being that old hag of over a year ago. First, the scouting missions will be ramping up. I want anyone with speed, concealment and sensory abilities to be inserted in a reconnaissance unit effective immediately. The only exceptions I will allow are those in commanding roles. All Tier 5 admirals will be responsible for securing a 10-kilometer coastal buffer. The ocean has been ruled by beasts for too long. How useless are you all for allowing this to continue? All Tier 5 generals will be in rotating vanguard positions. I don't want there to be a single moment in any single day where there is not any pressure being applied on these jumping monkeys of terrain. How long do you intend to allow them to gallivant on our turf? Is this what being a noble means to you? General Umbred, General Sater, General Tudo. Consider yourselves demoted. Your replacements will be the new General Milan, General Raj and General Joel. What? General Umbred stood in a rage, his mustache furiously blowing in all his anger. Sit down. Bread felt a cold shiver course through his veins. He met Maya's cold gaze, completely unable to stop his body from trembling. While you were holding yourself up in the safety of this dome, those three led a vanguard against the invalid tide. Yet, you still dare to call yourself a general and even raise your voice toward me? Who do you think you are? I sentence you to 3 years in Dark Cloud Prison. Take him away. Bread froze in shock. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Dark Cloud Prison wasn't a death sentence for himself, but it was most definitely one for his career. He couldn't believe what was happening. He didn't even know who this Milan person replacing him was, nor did he know a Joel or Raj. All he knew was they had to be commoners because the only ones who would have led a vanguard against that invalid tide were those with no standing. All he had done was follow the lead of everyone else, yet he was suffering the most. Even worse, because he couldn't control his temper, he ended up in an even worse position than the other two. Seeing such a scene, former Generals Sater and Tudo didn't even dare to breathe too heavily. They could only watch with sunken expressions as Bread was escorted out of the hall, his expression dark as could be. No one who had a criminal record was allowed to hold a government position above Tier 3. Bread was finished and the legacy his family had built to now had all come crumbling down just with a few words. Do you all really think I don't know what's been happening in my absence? This sort of dereliction of duty will not be tolerated. Every offender will receive a more damning sentence than the last. The next person to step out of line will receive 5 years, the next 10. Don't try my patience. Maya continued as though nothing had happened, listing off her commands. The more the nobles listened, the more they realized that Maya had ears everywhere. Every one of her new laws of order was pointed at a very particular problem that was almost impossible to notice on a whim. The more she spoke, the more the nobles felt their hearts tighten. They sat up straighter, their demeanor becoming several levels more respectful. At the same time, they began to look toward one another with wary gazes. The only way Maya could have managed this was if she had informants. But it was impossible to tell who they were. It left them all on the edge of their seats. They had no idea who had been secretly observing them all. As clever men and women used to the world of politics, they tried to pay attention to who Maya put in positions of power, trying to see if they could deduce who to be wary of in the future. But the more they tried to deduce, the more frustrated they became. The only obvious promotion Maya handed out was to those 3 commoners. The rest were either inconsequential or didn't change much at all. It left them all in a state of limbo, as though they were suspended above an abyss they could fall to the bottom of at any time. If they didn't know Maya was doing this on purpose by now, they wouldn't be worth the noble titles they had. With this kind of perpetual pressure, which of them would dare to step out of line? Finally, reorganize the inner city and make room for the commoners to enter. Level the outer city and repurpose the steel walls for some more practical defenses. The nobles felt like cleaning out their ears. What did Maya say just now? Allow the commoners in? Maya's words were final. She didn't even bother to explain herself from start to finish. She never gave a reason for anything, but deep inside, the nobles knew exactly why she made every decision. This was the only one they couldn't quite wrap their minds around. But Maya didn't give some heartfelt speech about the importance of the people to convince them. She simply left her words behind and swayed her hips to leave. Internally, Maya giggled. Consider this a repayment of your favor, Lionel. You helped me gain the foothold I wanted in the Slayer Legion, and now I've reformed Royal Blue Fort to your ideals. Be sure to put in a good word for me to your Gramps. Maya smiled lightly, her mind spinning at speeds that could rival even Lionel's. As for what her plans and goals were, maybe only Maya herself knew this. Ah! Maya suddenly sped up her steps. Don't worry, Mommy's coming. Maya happily sashayed away. She really didn't like being away from her child. Even though the doctors swore the incubator was top of the line, she still preferred to oversee it all personally. On Camelot. Oh, Khaled is dead? Author's note below December 17, 21. Chapter 466. One would think that such a report would have landed on City Lord White's desk a long time ago. However, the City Lord wasn't the type of woman who enjoyed listening to reports on what she deemed as useless points. All she cared about was the result. Not only had the Lin barony fallen, but it had fallen within the time frame she had set. The number of soldiers she had lost were less important to her than the tasks they managed to complete. This might sound like a maddening philosophy to have, even to the point where it dehumanized one's own subordinates, and even worse, could be seen as foolish, but it was clear that City Lord White didn't care about the optics of such things. In the end, the result was an odd situation where City Lord White only learned about the passing of one of her white knights over a week later. Naya nodded. Yes, City Lord. He died along with 511 predator ravens. During the siege of the Lin and Pervaux baronies, we lost 37 of our 1022 men before managing to claim their territory. Soldier Cop took over White Knight Dior's position and has been taking control of the law and order of the troops. City Lord White waved a hand. Why are you telling me all of this? Naya didn't seem surprised the City Lord White didn't care about all these details. In truth, she wanted to be out on the battlefield herself, but this was a war where White City was just a single gear in a working system. She couldn't do as she pleased. She had to follow the plans laid out by the Kiafur family. This left her feeling quite antsy and irritable. She only managed to keep things together since it was Naya who was speaking. If it was anyone else, they likely would have tasted Clara by now. And the only reason Naya had such a pass wasn't because City Lord White allowed nonsense from her. Rather, it was because the City Lord was aware that Naya knew better than to waste her time. So, if Naya was bringing this up, it meant she had a very good reason to do so. There was a reason Naya was the only one allowed to be so near the City Lord so consistently. According to a report sent by Acting Commander Kopp, White Knight Dior lost in single combat at the hands of a child by the name of Lionel Morales. City Lord White's annoyed expression faded and she looked up at Naya. Naya nodded once again despite the fact City Lord White hadn't actually spoken any words. There are 3 things that we have to pay great attention to during this war. The first is the interference of the hidden families. The second is the interference of higher dimensional worlds. And lastly, we have to pay particular attention to the wielders of the world spirit. According to what is known, the second, third and fourth completers have well-known identities. However, the first completer has yet to be found. According to our intelligence and deductions, there are 3 individuals who have the potential to be the first completer. One of these individuals is expressly this Lionel Morales. City Lord White slowly stood. The world spirit, even in comparison to the interference of higher dimensional worlds, was the greatest potential variable of this world. The good news was that the world spirit should have been split into 4 parts. When in such a parsed situation, the abilities of the world spirit were significantly nerfed to the point of practically having no use. This in addition to the fact the abilities of world spirits were quite infantile at the early stages of such a world and it wouldn't be a large problem even if it was whole. However, the world spirit is what truly decided sovereignty over a world. Terrain had to ensure to grasp at least one of these 4 portions. Only by doing so would they be able to truly lay claim to this world. Also, though she is not among the most likely 3 I just mentioned, there is intelligence that Aina Brazinger is currently present on the battlefields. From our intelligence, she has a very close relationship with Lionel Morales. So, although she's unlikely to have been the first completer, getting to her would be valuable, regardless. Why do you wait so long to bring such information to me? I finally get to set out. City Lord, wait. Naya raised her voice slightly so that City Lord White didn't just storm off. If this short-haired woman caught a head of steam, it would be almost impossible to stop her. What is it? It isn't appropriate to make a move just yet. Our original plan didn't account for the Empire already having a presence on this moon already. But, it seems that before we appeared, the Empire had already sent Prince Noah Fox here to lead an army to assimilate Camelot and the Demon Empire. Noah Fox, isn't that? Yes, the 3rd completer, Prince Noah Fox. Isn't that even better? That means there are two potential world spirit pieces here. While this is true, it also means that we have to be careful. Prince Fox has already begun to lead a counterattack and we've already lost half of the territory we initially snatched due to poor foundations. Isn't that just more reason for me to go? Why are you wasting my time? City Lord White's expression darkened. Yes, it is important that you go, but not so that you can target Lionel Morales. We need to prepare a proper counterattack and sweep through Camelot in a single sweep. I suggest that you wait for us to turn Lin and Pervaux baronies into proper launch points. Both are important resources. Lin barony is a choke point that separates the kingdom from the wilderness. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's perfect for starving them of natural resources, whether that be wood or fresh water. Pervaux barony forms the final point of a triangle between Lin barony and Camelot and is a final barrier to the no man's land that separates Camelot and the Demon Empire. It's a perfect launch point to attack both the Demon Empire and the kingdom. We will secure the supply lines, cut off Camelot's resources, and create a perfect foundation for attack. Then you can move out, City Lord. City Lord White stared at Naya deeply for a moment before sitting back down. How much time? 2 months at the fastest, 3 at the latest. Fine. I'll let them live for a little longer, then. Chapter 467. The people of Terrain had no idea that the world spirit hadn't been separated into 4 like it would on other worlds. In Earth's case, a rare instance to be sure, the world spirit chose its host before the metamorphosis began. But, somehow, this news was kept as a complete secret. Even after years of preparation, Terrain was completely unaware. That said, could they be blamed? A fourth-dimensional world with limited talent and scope like Terrain wasn't even aware that a world spirit could make such autonomous decisions at such an early stage. Due to the fact they weren't aware, they weren't even looking for it before Earth's metamorphosis began. As the saying went, you didn't know what you didn't know. How could Terrain be aware of something they weren't even aware they should be aware about in the first place? After the metamorphosis began, Terrain used special channels to learn about who the 4 completers were. Through their investigations, they managed to learn about 3 of them, the 3rd completer of which was Prince Noah Fox. Of course, no one was aware of the fact that due to him waking up so much earlier than everyone else, Lionel was by far the first to complete a zone. In fact, the time difference was a staggering several-month gap. If it wasn't for the fact Lionel was injured to the point of falling into a coma and having to be nursed back to health by Uncle Montez, he would have exited long before anyone else, and his status as the first completer would have been more obvious to all. But, for now, others could only speculate about his identity. Still, even then, Lionel's performance was so dazzling that he had become a prime suspect regardless. Prince Noah Fox stood tall on a battlefield, his breathing almost too even. It was difficult to tell that he had just been in a battle to begin with. Despite the fact the corpses of his enemies lay before him, their blood dripping from the blade of his saber, he didn't seem happy in the slightest. They're stalling. Noah spoke to no one in particular. This white city was exceptionally cruel. Without thought for casualties, they threw army after army of troops at them. It was as though they wanted them to waste time cutting them all down like they were weeds to be disgusted by rather than people. In truth, Noah was indifferent to it all. He just didn't like what it could possibly mean. Since they were stalling, there had to be a purpose for it. So, what was that purpose, exactly? At that moment, an agile black wolf of over 3 meters tall shot to Noah's side. In one instant, it was as swift as the wind, and in the next it came to a grinding halt without warning. It was as though it had never been running to begin with. A petite young woman with short hair swooped down from the top of the wolf. "Your Highness, it may be time to begin to coordinate with Camelot and the Demon Empire. It's clear that they've prepared for a long time and know more about us than we do them. Though we've won all of our battles, they're hollow victories." Jessica spoke as plainly as she always did. It had already been a month since Noah had a conversation with his grandfather. In that time, He had managed to reclaim over half the territory White City had taken from Camelot, but there were a few problems with this. For one, technology wasn't functioning as it once had. Without it, it wasn't possible to erect forts like they had on Earth with any sort of speed. So, though they had reclaimed the land, it was more like they had pushed out White City's presence. Secondly, White City had managed to keep a strict hold of 2 strategic points even to now. Though they lost battles without a care, they always managed to keep control over what was truly important. Thirdly, they hadn't originally come here for such a long, drawn-out war. Thanks to their skills, food and water wasn't a problem, but there was more than this one needed for war. They needed a steady supply of weapons and weapon maintenance options, which they didn't have. They needed healers and doctors, but they were in short supply of them. And they needed numbers in order to keep control and scout out the areas they had taken hold of. But they had none of these things. Due to this, Noah had hoped to make a strong push and place White City on its back foot as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, though he succeeded, the issue was that their success wasn't great enough to warrant any sort of happiness. It was essentially hollow. Noah nodded. I agree. I believe we've displayed enough of our strength. With a shake of his wrist, a strong vibration shot through Noah's blue-bladed saber. His strength caused the metal to bend and groan, whipping the blood on its way. In an instant, the blade was once again spotless. Should we arrange a meeting? No. We will meet on the battlefield. Noah said plainly. Understood. While Noah was leading attacks toward Pervaux Barony, heading a charge from the direction of No Man's Land, Camelot and the Demon Empire was heading a charge toward Lynn Barony. Yet, despite this pincer attack from both sides, White City continued to fend off their attempts. The dauntless approach of the soldiers of White City shook the knights and mages of Camelot to the core. To be so fearless in death, even after so many battles, wore on the souls of their enemies, making them feel as though this was a battle they would never win. As a result, despite the fact King Arthur had been experiencing maybe the most peaceful time of his life, it was overshadowed by a perpetual fog that hung over Camelot. What didn't help was the fact Camelot lacked the same level of organization White City's armies did. And, as their knights and mages awakened to their new abilities, it made the battlefield even more chaotic than they should have been. Without proper guidance on how to use these suddenly newfound powers, Camelot's victories were even more Pyrrhic than Noah's had been. It was on this day, on yet another battlefield, that Aina could be found, her lips tightly sealed as she swung her great sword toward another enemy. Chapter 468. Aina felt her arms trembling on impact. She could see the indifferent eyes of the White City soldier through their crossed blades. However, despite the dull pain in her arms and the trembling of her knees, her gaze too remained unmoved. Somewhere deep inside, she quite appreciated these soldiers of White City. Their emotionless, unquestionable resolve toward battle, as though they could forget about everything else other than the opponents before them. She too could resonate with this feeling. While Lionel felt an excitement when he laid eyes on a battlefield, Aina felt a soothing calm. However, the raging blood in her veins told a completely different story. Unfortunately, this battlefield was completely unlike the battles Aina had experienced in the Joan Zone or even against the Invalids and Braziner family members she faced alongside Lionel. Whereas in those battles, she reaped lives as though they were weeds, on this battlefield she felt as though it was her own life that was constantly in danger. Even finding an opponent like this whom she was evenly matched with was a problem. This wasn't because Aina was too weak, but rather because the soldiers of White City were simply too strong. Aina needed to exchange several moves to take down just a single one. And, since this was a battlefield and not a sanctioned duel, how could it possibly be that she would always be allowed a one-on-one battle? Aina dug deep, a light shout parting her lips as she pressed her great sword forward. An audible snap rang out. But, on such a large battlefield, the only two who likely heard it were Aina and the soldier before her. Other than a light flash in his gaze, the soldier didn't show any other reaction to Aina's blade piercing through his shoulder and cutting down through his hip. Aina took deep breath, her amber eyes shooting forward as though already looking for a new opponent. But she quickly found that there were already none left. At that moment, an irrational rage welled up in her heart as she pulled her sword out from the corpse before her. Unfortunately, this small action caused her legs to tremble beneath the weight she carried. Aina stabbed her sword into the ground, her body almost unable to continue standing. Heal, Aina urged through her own thoughts, forcing her body to rapidly repair itself. The strain caused her scars to become even more inflamed. If others were paying attention, it would become very obvious that the restrictions Aina was under didn't leave even her ability be. Just as Aina's vision was swimming, she suddenly felt an arm wrap around her shoulders. She looked up to find Mordred looking toward her with a worried expression. Mordred was quite tall for a woman, almost a head taller than Aina. Even so, her visage was quite clear. "Are you all right?" Aina nodded faintly. Mordred wanted to say more, but her expression suddenly changed. "It can't be another one?" Mordred's brow furrowed. "Is there a problem?" Aina looked around the battlefield, but from what she could see, it was another victory. Though they had lost quite a number of knights and mages, it was still a victory nonetheless. Those that hadn't died had already long since retreated, so it was hard to tell what reason there could possibly be to have such a reaction. That said, Aina was also very much aware that her sensory abilities weren't very good. So, she deferred to the most talented mage of Camelot. Aside from maybe Lionel, it was doubtful that there was anyone else on this moon with stronger internal sight in comparison to the Demon Empress. Mordred's brows furrowed tighter. "It's another army. I thought it was more men from White City, but it seems like this isn't the case. If it's not them, then it's more likely that it's the Empire?" According to what Mordred knew, the Empire had been attacking from the direction of Prevost's barony. Though it hadn't been expressly stated, their actions most definitely took a lot of pressure off of Camelot and allowed the Demon Empire to focus all their thoughts on support. What Mordred expected the least, though, was that they'd leave their pincer position and come here. What purpose did they have for doing this? It can't be that they wanted to attack Camelot now, right? At the moment, this battlefield was under Mordred's command and the large majority of the troops were demons. As for King Arthur's armies, they were on the more northern wing of the battlefield. This was for the best. Though they now had an alliance, one couldn't just magically forget the past enmities between humans and demons. So, trying to fuse them into one fighting force would be like asking for problems to break out. This was all to say that in order for the Empire to make it to them, they would most definitely have to go through Mordred and her men first. It doesn't look like they came to battle, but it doesn't look like they came on friendly terms either. After a while passed, the Empire's armies finally entered Aina's sensory ranges. She was exceptionally sensitive to matters related to battle and could read the air quite well. The Empire definitely wasn't here for peace, but they didn't seem to be here to battle either. One might want to say that they came here as a neutral party, but it wasn't quite that either. At the helm of the army, Prince Noah Fox stood on the back of a black wolf. Despite its swaying body, he didn't seem to be impacted in the slightest. To his back, a group of nearly 1,000 followed along. Many were also riding such wolves, but others rode various other beasts. Though the army wasn't completely uniform due to this, they still carried an oddly structured and strict air to them. Even their mismatching beasts couldn't detract from this. It didn't take Mordred much to realize that these beasts were actually the demonic beasts of No Man's Land. Somehow, the Empire had subjugated and domesticated these wild beasts even to the point of taking them to war. Noah had no idea that this action alone left Mordred in more awe than any of their other combined other actions had. Only she, who had been trying to reel in and reign over these beasts for decades, knew exactly how difficult it was. What was their goal here, exactly? Chapter 469. The slow approach of the Empire's warriors eventually put Mordred at ease. It seemed that Aina's words had been correct. If their goal was to attack, they would have long since broken out into a charge. But their current pace was almost like a leisurely stroll. In fact, they even allowed Mordred enough time to reorganize her army and face their entourage head-on. By now, Arthur's warriors had also noticed the oddity. "Your Majesty, should we send someone?" Arthur shook his head. "I will go personally. Allow the men some rest and treat the injured. There's no telling when they will choose to attack again." Noah's troops came to a halt about 100 meters from Mordred's front line. Without a word, a small squad of 5 broke off, riding their black wolves forward swiftly. Though their pace was still a bit faster than the army had been, it still didn't seem like their goal was to attack. The group of 5 was led by a young man. The expression on his face was indifferent and lofty. He carried the air of arrogance nobility should have, but without allowing it to grow overblown. It was just enough to put many in a state of awe without allowing them to feel any sort of disgust. It was clear that this young man's air of superiority was ingrained down to his very bones. When the small squad made it to within 5 meters of Mordred, they came to a stop, maintaining a healthy distance. "I am the representative of His Highness, Prince Noah Fox, Junior Governor Duke Niall Briarmouth." "Who is your leader?" Niall's voice boomed over the battlefield. He didn't seem to realize that Mordred was right before him. Whether he did it on purpose or not, it was hard to tell. However, regardless, Mordred maintained her composure. She had been through much more in her life. If there was one thing she was excellent at, it was maintaining her calm. "I am the leader of the Demon Empire," she said unhurriedly. "I am the leader of Camelot." At that moment, Arthur had made his way to Mordred's side. His expression wasn't as calm as his daughter's. Rather, it still held a lofty air. Niall looked down from his position atop his wolf, sweeping a glance over the two of them. His gaze happened to catch upon Aina, her appearance causing him to frown. Her face made him inwardly uncomfortable, but he hid it well. There was no need to linger on such things. Though he could be wild at other times, it was unnecessary at this moment. But, just when he planned to focus on Arthur and Mordred once again, his lips even opening to speak, his gaze sharpened. He looked back toward Aina, his eyes landed on the hand she used to lean against her great sword with. No, it was more accurate to say that his gaze landed on the wrist of the hand she was using. Even at this moment, Aina's breathing was still a bit haggard. The only reason she was still at the front of the army was because Mordred had insisted on keeping her by her side because she was worried about Aina's current state. For the past month and a half or so, Aina had done nothing but battle. It was hard to allow such a petite young girl to bear such a burden on her shoulders constantly, but Aina insisted to the point Mordred couldn't reject. "You." Aina didn't think anyone would be talking to her at this moment, so she was entirely focused on her recovery. She was trying to force her ability to activate again, but it had slowed down considerably. Her reaction, though, caused Niall's frown to deepen. As though finally sensing that the atmosphere was oddly silent, Aina looked up, only to find that Niall's gaze was locked onto her. Of course, Aina was confused by this. She wasn't well known among the nobles. And, even if she was, this definitely wouldn't be the face they recognize. Beyond that, she didn't share the red hair and eyes of the Brazinger family. Even one of her own family members only managed to recall her due to his perfect recall ability, and he had long since been buried beneath dozens of meters of earth. So, it was even less likely that she'd be remembered for this. "State your name and which province you come from. Are you planning on defecting from the Empire?" Niall's gaze sharpened, boring into Aina as though trying to force her into a confession. Yet, despite looking up toward Niall with tired eyes, Aina didn't seem intimidated in the slightest. What a joke! If Aina could remain calm and unperturbed beneath Lionel's aura, what was a mere junior Governor Duke worth? Of course, at this moment, Aina wasn't necessarily thinking of things in such simple terms. She only knew that she was unmoved by it all. In fact, she was even slightly annoyed. Compared to others, Aina was actually quite thankful for the Empire. If not for it, she would have likely suffered even more hardship as a child. But Aina's main priority was still revenge. What the Empire cared about her actions toward reaching this goal meant little to nothing to her. My name is Aina Brazinger, I come from Royal Blue Province. No, I have no intention of defecting from the Empire. Aina replied somewhat wearily. Then how is it that you are here and not protecting Royal Blue Fort? Niall's words froze. Did you just say Aina Brazinger? Niall suddenly remembered that almost a year ago now, they received a report that they would be gaining 2 more variants from Royal Blue Fort. One was a certain Lionel Morales and the second was Aina Brazinger. But, for whatever reason, those 2 never appeared. Due to Earth's talents, after over a year of development, the rarity of variants had plummeted as well. From just a handful, it had blossomed to several thousand. In fact, in their current army, not a single one wasn't a variant. Of course, those who were variants from the very beginning were far more valuable. And Lionel and Aina were among this very rare few. In fact, considering where they started, they should be among the few who already had abilities within the 5th dimension. However, with this didn't come leniency. Rather, it made Aina's wrongdoing several times more severe. The action of not properly reporting to the capital could be considered a direct defiance of the Emperor's will. After reaching this point in his thoughts, Niall's aura became baleful. You're tuning in to the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.